Okay, good morning. Um, Thank you for joining us this morning for the Oregon State Board of Agriculture meeting. Today is Wednesday, August 16, 2023. This is Luisa Santamaria, Chair of the Board. This meeting is now called to order. I love this part. Okay, let's start. I would like to begin by asking the Department of Agriculture Board Coordinator Carla Banes to review a few housekeeping items for the meeting.
Good morning. Just a reminder to please mute your phones or your computer audio to prevent unnecessary background noise. If you're joining the call by conference call, we would request only board members and presenters turn on your camera during the call. And if you're joining by conference call only, pre-meeting materials are posted on the ODA website at odadirect/board agriculture. Also, we will post presentations following the meeting. And a reminder that this meeting is being recorded.
Thank you, Carla. Carla, will you please call the roll for introductions? I will begin. I'm Luisa Santamaria, public member of the board.
Chad Allen is joining later. Barbara Blair.
Barbara Boyer, Chair of the Soil Water Conservation Commission.
Brian Harper.
Brian Harper, Farmer, Junction City.
Shante Johnson. Miguel Lopez.
Miguel Lopez, public member, Carlton, Oregon.
Elin Miller.
Elin Miller, Farmer, Umpqua.
Eric Oram.
Eric Oram, Farmer, Hepner.
Eddie Spotty. Randy Kinkers.
We can't hear Carla.
Oh,
Oh, she cannot hear. Are you mute?
Randy, this is Lauren, the acting director. Can you hear us? Would you introduce yourself if you can?
Yeah, Randy Savati, member, Ontario.
Thank you. Good morning.
Josh Zelensky.
Is he online? Josh, are you online with us? If you are, could you introduce yourself?
Why can't they hear me? Dean Simonich.
Stacy Simonich, Dean of Oregon State University's College of Agricultural Sciences and Director of the Oregon Agricultural Experiment Station.
And Director Henderson.
Good morning, everyone. Lauren Henderson, acting director with the Oregon Department of Agriculture.
I don't know. I'm having trouble with my audio.
Your mic is here now.
I don't know.
It is. Well, unmuted the speaker, not the mic. Okay. Speaker.
Sorry about the audio. We're getting that fixed. Just a reminder, if you're joining us in person, to please add your name to the sign-in sheet on the table. If you're joining the meeting online, please add your name in the chat box as a sign-in. Do we have anyone on the conference call only that would like to introduce themselves? And then we'll go around the room quick. Jonathan.
Jonathan Sandown, Assistant Director, Oregon Department of Ag.
Chris Benjamin, Program Area Director, Oregon Department of Ag. Jennifer Crane, HR Director, Oregon Department of Ag.
Isaac Stapleton, Program Area Director, Department of Ag.
Greg Holmes, Working Lands Program Director, 1000 Friends of Oregon. Bill Miller, Farmer, Umpqua, Oregon.
Julie Leone, Food Safety Specialist, Tillamook.
Rusty Rock, Program Director, Department of Ag.
Jim Johnson, Land Use and Water Planning Coordinator, Oregon Department of Agriculture.
Hillary Foote, Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation and Development.
Dave Losh, State Staff, USDA National Ag Stat Service.
Tammy Kerr, Executive Director, Oregon Dairy Farmers Association, and Tillamook native.
Morning, Eric Morris, Oregon Department of Agricultural Program Manager.
All right, thank you. And I think George didn't introduce, so please. George, can you hear us?
Yeah. Are we checking in? I'm Josh Zielinski, farmer from Salem, Oregon.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Carla. So we're going to continue with our meeting, and we have some opening remarks. And note that the public comment is scheduled for today at 10:15 a.m. We have received 2 written public comments and 1 request to provide verbal comments at today's meeting. So if you would like to sign up this morning to provide verbal comments in person, please use the sign up sheet on the table prior to the comment period. If you are joining the meeting online, please make a request using the chat box, including your name and organization. And comment time will be limited for 3 minutes per person. As Carla said, this meeting is recorded, and whenever you talk, please state your name for the record before you begin your comments. All right, so we're going to continue with the first item in our agenda, that is the approval of the minutes from the June meeting. You have in your package, the number 1 is the minutes from our last meeting. So I'm going to ask, do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Elin Miller moved to approve.
Brian Harper, second.
It is moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Any discussion from any of the board members? Okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. All right. Based on the outcomes of the vote, we have the motion, and the motion passes. All right. Our next item in our agenda is the ODA project overview. I'm going to introduce the acting director, Laura Henderson, for this. Thank you.
Good morning. I have a very brief director's report that I'll give you, and then we'll move into the next line item. So Jonathan, you can join me anytime you want here. Just real briefly, we're starting to implement our new budget. We'll be more in depth on that. I think when it gets audited and final approval, we don't have that yet for our budget. That takes a tremendous amount of time for the state to go through that and our staff. So we can talk more about that. We've talked about it in the past, but I'm feeling pretty good about where we're at. If you remember, I've probably said this at every board meeting. I'm grateful for keeping what we have. I mean, you have to start these budgets sometimes in that place. And so for the most part, we have our core work funded well. I do have some concerns about our cash balances in our programs. I spent this last weekend working through that and worrying. That's what I do about that, because a big part of our budget is other funds, and those are not guaranteed. Those come from our license fees and our fee-for-service programs, and I'm really concerned about that. Not alarmed, but concerned. And so we will be talking more about that and where we may need some adjustments in some of our programs. I don't have a good feel for that today, where that's at, but I know there'll be a few of them that are struggling. We manage those programs just like a business. We have to. And I've done that for years. And our team is catching on to that in places. Those that the program directors know it and worry about it probably just as much as I do, but more to come on that. I'm just throwing that out there because I've been told, wow, you guys got a huge budget. And yes, we did, but it's just permission to spend. It doesn't necessarily mean that the dollars are there, but we'll go through that and plan ahead. That's what we do well at the department, is plan ahead. I try to look at things 2 to 4 years down the road, so that we're not surprised. So that's that. The laboratory that was funded in our budget is on track. They had a little bit of a setback, but I need to get more serious with our programs about the move dates and answering questions about moving. But I would anticipate our staff would be migrating to the new building in Wilsonville sometime between October. I was saying December. It's possible it will creep into January. Would love to have the board. You already toured it once, but you ought to see it now. Tour again sometime when we can make that work. It's a beautiful space for a very important purpose in our agency, which is our regulatory and our science work. So I'm looking forward to that. The other thing that we're hearing a lot about lately and this week is not helping is the weather and the heat, and continued pressure on our crops. Cherries, you might have read about that a little bit, and the tremendous struggles they've had on that harvest. And California's had the same problems, and then of course it will trickle up to Washington. So there'll be more to come on that. Whether a disaster declaration can be made or not is still being worked on. You have to have certain elements for the governor to ask the USDA secretary for those of that. But Jonathan and I will be working on that. I anticipate out of this heat, we may hear more concern out of the heat. It's always comes at the wrong time. I don't know if there is a right time for anything anymore. But I'm hearing on the east side of the state about some issues with production levels and those kinds of things. So I do worry about that. So we are hearing more about that. You'll hear more about that as the fall wraps up. Jonathan and I will be attending in beautiful Cheyenne, Wyoming, the National Directors Conference, all 50 states in Guam. That will be hosted by Cheyenne. And so I know that we'll be hearing more and more about the West concerns, particularly with our good friends in Hawaii and the horrible fires that are there right now. And our hearts go out to them. And I sent a message to the director there and haven't heard back for obvious reasons. I'm sure they're busy and swamped and trying to support their communities. So there's that. The other thing I just wrap up with is we're hiring and getting our staff filled some of the positions that are critical positions. And so you will hear more of those introductions. We have Eric, our new program manager over commodity oversight program. I'm thrilled to have Eric on board. You will also see staff show up at our board meetings, staff that are local to the area. Hopefully you see more of them. Please introduce yourselves, and the staff that are here, please feel free to interact with the board. That's important to me, that our staff get out and are able to experience what our board is about and what our agency does in places, and has a better understanding, I think, of all the things that our agency does, which are many. And then the last thing I would just say is an appreciation to all of you and your time on the board. I had the pleasure of working on some other appointments in another board, and it just dawned on me how much time people really do give to these boards and commissions, and have to sacrifice for that. So thank you, board, for your service. It's really important to make our state go. So that's my board director's report.
Thank you. Anything, Jonathan?
I think he's going to help with the next one.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Lisa,
Madam Chair.
For the record. Oh, I want to ask if there are some. Yes.
Madam Chair, Elon Miller for the record. I did have a question. Lauren, could you refresh our memory on the steps for national disaster? And then we in Oregon stepped up big time with the ODEP deal. Was that 2 years ago now? What the process is, knowing that you need to have governor approval probably after Fed, but I didn't know what the process might be and timing would be with the need board.
Jonathan, you want to tackle that? I know you know this better than I do.
Good morning, Director Henderson, Chair Santa Maria, members of the board, Jonathan Sandow. So the request for USDA secretarial designation, the requests have to come from the governor of the state up to the USDA secretary, and then through that process, the USDA then reaches out to like the local FSA office, and there are various metrics that have to, that are demonstrated, that are examined, certain loss criteria, weather events. So drought has its own kind of track that has different triggers in it. There are other disaster declarations that can be issued, and so I think the one that has gotten the most media attention is the cherries out of the Hood River, Wasco County area. That's not to say it's the only area that's been hit. It's just the one that I think has been in the media quite a bit. And so using that as like a live case example, right? They're gonna, we're gonna look at, when was the duration, what period of time was the weather event? What correlation did it cause to the damage? And then FSA also goes in with their abilities and kind of surveys and documentation, and then that all feeds into if the secretary issues the declaration or not. And what the declaration really helps accomplish is there are a few efforts that or have ability to access, right, for producers. I'd say the more significant outcome of a declaration is if Congress was to ever reauthorize or issue an ad hoc disaster program, right? So the ERP was the most recent one, right? The Emergency Relief Program. Then those counties then qualify, producers in those counties or secondary, primary, secondary counties then qualify for those ad hoc disaster assistance programs. And so that, given the totality around the natural disasters around this entire country, I would say it's probably being worked on right now at the congressional level for some sort of reauthorization of an ad hoc disaster program. We haven't engaged our federal delegation yet at that level, but that would be the next steps as well. To try to get that all timing worked out. In terms of any state level assistance, that it's independent of a USDA secretary designation, and that is a complete authorization within the state legislature. I would say that the compounding events that led up to ODAP were very unique, and because it's quite, it's an expensive endeavor, right? And when the federal government has those resources, there's a balance there. So yeah, it is a separate and distinct option from any federal USDA pathways.
Thank you. Right. Luisa Santamaria, for the records, I was going to ask if somebody else wants to make a comment.
Thank you, Barbara Boyer. Lauren, you said that you've got some concerns about the cash balance. And did I hear you say that the fees for service are down? Is that what's concerning you?
Lauren Henderson, Acting Director. In some cases, that's true. In our fee-for-service programs, many of those fees are generated on volume. And if the crop volumes are down or our inspection are down, then the revenue's down. You would think, well, then that's off balance by you don't need as many staff. It doesn't quite work that way, and I can pontificate for hours on why it doesn't work that way, but it doesn't work that way. So that's one area. Some other areas are just like all of you. Our expenditures are going up. Fuel is up. Just to have our staff out statewide, those expenses are up, even though we've cut in places and done some things there. So it's the combination of all of that. The other thing is we try to be proactive, but at the same time carefully conservative, so that we don't get ahead of what people can actually pay for and do that. Sometimes the timing is wrong. We don't quite get it right. We've heard over and over, I would rather you do incremental, smaller increases than go a long time and do a big one. I've heard I'd rather you not do it that way, and I don't know what the right way is. Probably the answer is it's based on the program. Yeah.
I'm going to ask if the members of the board that are joining remotely have any comment or question. No? No? Okay. Well, let's continue with our agenda now. We have the ODA budget and legislative update. Please, Jonathan Sando.
So good morning, Jonathan and I will tag team on this a little bit. We don't have a lot in depth here, but just for the board, ODA has a lot going on right now with projects. The two that are mentioned here is the agency strategic plan and the RFSI program, the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program. Those are top of the mind right now, and we'll be bringing to the board on some regular basis kind of where we're at with the many projects that we do have going on right now. But on the agency strategic plan, I think it's in your packets, so you should have the reminder there. For those of you that were part of the board, Barbara, maybe Brian, that might be it, may remember that endeavor. The agency strategic plan and part of the governor's new initiative for state agencies is to make sure that every agency has a strategic plan. We were fortunate enough to have this one. However, there are some requirements that if you didn't meet certain dates that you have to get one in place, and I can't remember the date now. Do you? Is it December? No. What's the strategic plan date, Carla? June. For this, and so the reason why we're bringing that up today is one, to remind you about our strategic plan. If you didn't know we had one, it's 7 objectives, and then there's the data behind each objective. There was a lot of work that went into this in 2016 later, and then 17, and then it crossed over from former Director Koba to Director Taylor to put their stamp on that. A lot of work. We brought this to the board. There was some confusion at that point in time that it was the board strategic plan. It's really the Department of Agriculture strategic plan. However, the board is an important part of what's in that plan and how the board interacts with the agency, and of course you all represent agriculture as leaders and what agriculture needs from your department. So what I would ask you to do is to look at this and think about it, and then we will be finding someone. I'd hope that our previous person that helped facilitate our discussions could help us again, but darn it, he retired, and a good retirement for him. But so we'll be looking for someone to help with that, and then I anticipate we will be doing some outreach around the strategic plan, and whether this is right, whether it needs to be a little more focused and those kinds of things. My sense is it'd probably be better if we could get it to 5 or 6 objectives instead of the 7. The other thing that it's missing that was not done on purpose, but the diversity, equity, inclusion elements, which is also something we're working on as a separate plan, need to be embedded in each one of these. It's not clear that it's in there, and of course it is. How can you be a role model organization without that? And so we'll be working to embed that in each of these places where they need to be, and our staff are thinking about that, and we'll be working on that. So Jonathan, did you have anything more you wanted to add to that?
Through the chairs, the board members, I would just add that part of it today is just introducing it, reintroducing it to the board, and then we will have kind of subsequent conversations as we get as we go through the process. So no real ask or action item today on this, but just more of a if you didn't know we had a strategic plan, here it is, and kind of the process that is going to be upcoming for the agency as we go through it.
Elin Miller for the record. Appreciate you looping us in early. And I guess a question I've got, there were a lot of questions, a lot of touch points through the plan that talked about feedback and mechanisms for gathering information. And I would just like to suggest that consideration be made for truly another SWOT analysis, a pretty in-depth one, to help feed into the department. And it's always great because it's been since 2016, right? So it's good to probably have that as part of the analysis with internal within the agency, as well as the some of the external inputs that you've got from some of the different bases. So I'm sure you're already thinking about that, but just in case.
Yeah. Elin, thank you for that. Lauren Henderson. I I think the more help we can get on that, the more thinking about it, the more it can be the ODA strategic plan. But it really is a plan for how we do our work. And we're pretty proud of how we do our work, but having that external input and as well as our internal is a very valuable part of these exercises. I think certainly from an accountability measure, and one of the reasons why the governor put this at a high priority for some agencies is there were some agencies, quite a few, that don't have one at all. And I look at this as our blueprint. And certainly when you try to attract new staff, one of the things that they ask about is, what is your strategic plan? And so it's important to that. It can be a recruitment tool. It can be lots of things for your agency, but most and foremost from my director's seat is it really helps lay the foundation for where we're going and what we're doing and how we do that. So thank you for that. That's why we're bringing it today, is so you guys can help us think through that, and then we'll figure out what that structure looks like to receive the input.
Jonathan, do you have something else to add? No? So, okay. Thank you. No more questions?
The second item, I'm trying to find where it's at here, is the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program. I think we talked about that before. ODA, or the state of Oregon, was allotted around $5.9 million, I think it was.
It'll be behind tab 2, behind the strategic plan.
Oh, thank you. In what USDA had made available through the 50 states, we're having to put our plan together this week, or submit it this week. And we've had staff and a project team working through that. And the purpose of this was just to tell you that's where we're at, is we're putting in what I'm going to call an outline of a plan. And the outline of the plan is what our approach is going to be to make sure that we meet the targets of the plan. And once we get our plan in and have USDA look at it, we will share that back out. But there's a lot of work to do. This is a 2027 project from here to there. And I only brought that up today. In your tab, you can see what the purpose is, so I won't go through all of that there. But there is a survey that we have out there today. I think we have had 40 or so folks respond, and I believe, Carla, is that out on our website, the survey, if people want to take it? Do you know?
No, it's not out on our website, but we've been distributing it through our listservs, and I will distribute it out to the board in case you missed that. Specifically, then if you could share it with your networks.
Yes, that would be super appreciated. It has a list of questions about the opportunity and what the department can do there. I had in Denver at the WASDA meeting, we actually had the administrator over this program at WASDA. It is a pretty quickly implemented project from USDA, but they made it very clear to the states that, knowing that I got notice in May and had to sign a cooperative agreement for that amount of money, and then our plan had to be in August, with all the work we have to do to make sure that we're doing the right outreach and making sure that people are able to participate in that amount of dollars. That's a pretty significant amount of money for Oregon for the purposes of the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure. It's really helped that middle of the supply chain in areas. And so I think one place that I think you'll know that could benefit from this is the Farm to School program. There may be some opportunities there for that, but lots of others too. And I know that USDA really wanted to get the money obligated and out the door. So that's why we're on this fast pace. So what I want the board to know today is really that we are on target to get our plan in this week. It's really a outline of a plan. It can be changed, so it's not something that once we're stuck with and doing that. And then I would anticipate in November I will be able to articulate a lot more detail about what we're doing and how we're outreaching and that. But the best thing the board can do right now is know about this. And then, Carla, if you could send the survey out, and if you could network with your folks, they may get it 2-3 times, but that's okay. And get people to respond to the survey, because that's really our first step to get information about where people would like to see the the money go and what the benefits would be there. So that's really what I wanted to say there. Jonathan, did you have anything to add there? I'm really excited about the possibilities here. This is a little bit like what we did with the state meat inspection program for the same reasons. This state meat does not qualify for this because there's other programs, but it's for the same purpose, which is how do we build up that infrastructure and make it more resilient than what we had before. So I'm pretty excited about the possibilities here and the amount of dollars that are going in there. And then just one other thing. I got one more thing to do with this, and that is we don't have the spending limitation for this yet, but that's okay. We're not going to be spending any dollars before February, which would be my next opportunity. So I will still need to go to the legislature and ask for the money to go with it. They already gave me the permission to apply, so that's just, I don't anticipate any issues with that, but that's a to-do thing before we can actually spend the dollars.
So you use, Barbara Boyer, you use the term apply. So did you ask for the 5.9 or was that something the USDA gave the state?
Lauren Henderson, Barbara, what you don't often get a call that says, hey, Lauren, you're going to get $5.9 million. That's literally what happened. I was expecting when I heard about it that we might get a couple million. It was based on an allocation formula, and Oregon did pretty well in that allocation formula. So it wasn't a competitive grant. Every state got an allocation. We can share that with the board if you'd like to see that. I think California got 30 something, quite a bit more. They're a big state though. So no, every state got something, and then I had like I think maybe 2 weeks to sign the cooperative agreement to put our name in the hat that we wanted the money. So I did that in May, and then we did get permission from the legislature to actually apply, so to speak, or sign that agreement, and then we'll be asking for the actual expenditure authority to spend it. So I did hear that there's a couple of states that were thinking about just not accepting the money because they just didn't have the bandwidth to do it. If that were the case, I would hope every state would take advantage of this and figure out a way to do it. But if that were the case, I would anticipate that money would go back in the pool and then they would reallocate it somehow.
Okay, Luisa Santa Maria for the record. If we don't have any other comments.
Online, folks.
Yeah, there's someone online remotely. No, Josh? Okay. So I think we can continue with our agenda today. And the next item is agri-tourism and recreation uses.
No, we're going to do the budget real quick.
We'll just.
Okay, I'm confused now.
No, we're good.
All right, I thought you already were done. I just was asking. Okay.
It's the Lauren and Jonathan show for one more
You
second.
haven't followed the schedule. Okay, now, okay, sorry, Jonathan.
All right, through the chairs.
Yeah, I was waiting for that, and you said, no, I don't have that. All right, go ahead.
Board members, I'll make it real quick because I know that 9:15 we'll get going on the next presentation. Not too much change from the last board meeting. Legislature hasn't been in session, which is always good. But I would say just kind of the few key highlights. One, we got through the veto deadline. Nothing within our budget or major policy bills was on that list or impacted by any of the veto actions. And so everything that we've talked about is moving forward. Most of the major policy bills have been signed, and so that they are in an official capacity. There are a few I think that are awaiting some ceremonial signatures, but other than that, everything is pretty well signed and moving on its way. And then signed by the governor, that is. And then I think just for a heads up for September legislative days, which are slated for the last week of September, we will have our canola report with legislative recommendations, which we were tasked for. Elin Miller is our kind of our board rep on that group. We had one meeting, a week and a half ago, and we'll have another meeting next 2 weeks from now and then a third meeting to wrap up a report. It's an aggressive timeline to put together a legislative report with recommendations in there, but I'm confident in coming out of that last meeting. I think we have a good direction to go in. And then from that point, just so folks, the board members and folks are clear that from that point, then it's in the hands of the legislature, right? The Department of Ag is not introducing the legislation in the short session. It will go through the committee, and so, but we'll have a busy legislative session or Ledge Days in September working around that canola report, but we will accomplish that. And then the other pieces as we kind of just work through the implementation phases. Every policy bill has different implementation phases. Some are emergency clauses, so they took effect right away, which complicates a little bit of how we do administrative procedures and programs. Others have 91-day clauses or the typical January 1 implementation date. And so you'll see that we are, we'll start putting together either racks or different groups in kind of that order and priority organization in terms of when they become implemented and the programs they impacted. So that's just a real quick update on where we're at. And but wanted to definitely say appreciation to Elin, but then also to everyone else who's interacting with all those little implementations that we will be doing over the next couple months.
Elin Miller, and if anybody has any, questions, concerns, or ideas, please let's chat about canola. I'm kind of a non-geographic person on canola, and other than visiting canola fields in Canada is about all I've done. So I'm kind of a neutral person in this discussion. So.
Now I think we're done.
Okay. Now you can go there.
All right. Okay. You had a lot to say today. Thank you, Jonathan. Right. Let's go to our agritourism and recreational uses in Oregon's exclusive farm use zone. I'm going to call Jim Johnson for this presentation.
Okay, good morning. I hope you're ready for an hour's worth of just invigorating discussion here. This is actually a lot of law, so I apologize up front, but this is important stuff for y'all to understand. So next slide, please. So today's agenda, I'll briefly discuss Resolution 310, which is your resolution related to agritourism. Then Hillary, and I'll introduce Hillary here in a second, is going to briefly give you the site and situation, what's going on the ground out there in terms of agritourism related type activities. And then I'm going to dive into how various agritourism elements are authorized under state law in the exclusive farm use zone. I'm going to focus on the exclusive farm use zone. And then I'll end with discussing a few issues that we're dealing with, and ultimately then we can take any discussion and questions you'd like to go with there. So first, next slide, please. Resolution 310 is the Board of Agriculture's resolution that deals with siting of agritourism, entertainment activities, and associated activities on agricultural land. And you'll get a report tomorrow from the committee. We discussed that resolution yesterday. The current resolution, and I'm just broadly going to discuss that, I won't get into a lot of the details, we'll do that tomorrow, but the current resolution really recognizes that there are compatibility issues, conflicts with agriculture. There's positives and negatives to agritourism as it relates to commercial agricultural operations. The resolution also talks about the impacts that agritourism can have on rural infrastructure and services. Talks about how agritourism has uneven application across the state of Oregon. You can do some things in one county and different things in another county. Our resolution also talks about how agritourism can be of a benefit to agriculture when done correctly and in a compatible way. And your resolution also talks about that even with legislation that was adopted several years back relating to tourist events and the like, that there's still some very key issues, and we'll talk about those towards the end of whatever. That's a very nutshell focus on what the board's resolution currently does, and it is under review. That's I was asked to develop this presentation so that you can have a better understanding of what some of the issues are. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to introduce Hillary Foote to you. Hillary and I have worked together on land use issues for a long, long time. We have, believe it or not, pretty much the same background. Hillary was the county planner here in Tillamook County before she was hired by DLCD to be the farm forest coordinator. Hillary and I work really well together. I was a county planner before I went to DLCD, and then ODA stole me away from DLCD. So Hillary and I, are kind of joined at the hip half the time. And DLCD has a really great thing called the Exclusive Farm Use Report, and it tracks a lot of the uses in the exclusive farm use zone. And Hillary's going to talk to you a little bit about that as it relates to agritourism. So welcome, Hillary.
Great. Thank you for having me here this morning, and thank you for that introduction, Jim. So as Jim mentioned, Hillary Foote, the Farm and Forest Land Use Specialist for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And it's very nice to be here this morning because I live about a half hour north of here. So thank you for the short commute today. It's not often I get to join a meeting that's a little bit closer to home. So Jim asked me here today to talk a little bit about what DLCD is seeing in terms of permits issued for agritourism related activities in exclusive farm use zones. So we see agritourism businesses in a wide variety of zones, in cities, in unincorporated communities, in rural residential areas, on rural commercial areas. But what I'm going to talk about right now is when agritourism businesses are sited on land that's been protected as working farmland under Land Use Goal 3, under exclusive farm use zoning. Next slide, please. All right, so as Jim mentioned, as your policy resolution reflects, agritourism is a hot topic. It provides an opportunity for visitors to Oregon to experience Oregon agriculture. It provides additional income to farm operations, and it has been growing rapidly in the state. So looking back at the 2017 National Agricultural Statistics Survey, or NASS, they reported 16 million in revenue from agritourism and recreational services in the state of Oregon. And that represented a 51% increase over 2012, over that 5-year period. And that's actually quite a bit more than what the trend nationally was, which was about a 30% increase over that 5-year period. So this sector is growing in the state. But that growth has not come without controversy. As operators of agritourism businesses, work with a number of challenging issues and work through them with their neighboring farmers. Noise, dust, parking, traffic, litter, trespass. I'm sure this board has heard some of those common complaints related to some of these activities, that can be related to some of these activities. So agritourism permit approvals can be controversial, not just at the permitting phase, at the land use planning phase, but over time too. We see often when you have a small business and it becomes successful, it becomes popular and it grows, and occasionally grows outside of the bounds of what may have been permitted originally and becomes an enforcement issue. So that is becoming more common as well. The last thing I want to say here that makes this conversation this morning a little bit more difficult, and will take up the meat of this conversation, is that when we use the word agritourism, we don't all mean the same thing. So when I say agritourism, I could be talking about farm-to-table dinners or farm stays. Some people use it and they're talking about farm festivals and concerts and recreational trails and bed and breakfasts and all sorts of things. So there is no single definition of agritourism that is in statute or rule. So getting on the same page as to what agritourism actually is can make that challenging. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit this morning is how DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, has sort of treated that issue when we're trying to look at how agritourism is developing over our landscape. Next slide, please. And actually, we're going to skip that slide and go to the next slide. All right. So when land is protected under exclusive farm use zoning, when it's been protected as working with farmland under the state's program, that exclusive farm use zoning limits the uses that can be developed on that property to those uses that have been established by the legislature. There's about 60 of them, and they are codified in statute. And there's a whole nother discussion about how we got to have 60 uses that are permitted in farm zones, but that's for another day.
And that's another resolution.
So that list of 60 uses that can be developed in farm zones established by the legislature at the state level, and it's divided into two buckets: uses that are allowed outright, that the legislator found to be compatible with farm use, and then a second bucket of uses that may or may not be compatible. Those are called type 2 uses, and these are uses that the county needs to review publicly and find that they're not going to impact surrounding farm operations. And I think Jim's going to talk a little bit more about those two buckets in a bit. So out of that long list of 60 uses, there are really 9 uses on that list that, the department has picked out as potentially related to agritourism. All right. So wineries, cideries, breweries, outdoor mass gatherings, farm stands, agritourism related to commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, agritourism related home occupations. I can't read the slide because it's too far away and I'm getting old. Thank you. Private campgrounds and private parks. I think that's all of them, and guest ranches. So there's 9 specific uses off of that list that we talked about. These are in both categories, in that first bucket and in that second bucket. And some of these uses are obviously related to agritourism, like agritourism events, for example. That's a specific use. Some of these uses, like home occupations or commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, are uses that can encompass a wide variety of things. You can find a hair salon as a home occupation, or a tasting room as a home occupation. We at DLCD, we have insight into the specific use that's permitted through a reporting mechanism in farm zones. And so we've gone through and categorized all of those home occupations, commercial activities in conjunction with farm use that could be agritourism related. So for example, if there's a home occupation that's a bed and breakfast or a tasting room, we'll categorize it as commercial, as an agritourism related activity for reporting purposes. So once we take all of these 9 uses collectively, having sorted them for, which ones are actually agritourism related, we come up with about 21% of all non-dwelling permit approvals on farmland are related to agritourism. So about 1/5 of those applications that counties are processing are related to agritourism activities. The pie chart on the slide here breaks those down a little bit. And the big 3 that we see here, the light green one is commercial activities in conjunction with farm use that are agritourism related. Those are primarily tasting rooms and alcohol related facilities. The second big wedge is that dark green one there. Those are home occupations. And those are primarily going to be tasting rooms and bed and breakfasts, about 7% of all non-dwelling permit approvals in the state. And then the light pink wedge here are wineries, which also include tasting rooms, about 7% again of all permit approvals in the state and farm zones. So one of the things that you may have noticed I just said is that tasting rooms are approved in all three of those wedges. Which brings me to my next slide, which addresses this issue that a certain proposal in practice may be permitted through a number of different permitting avenues. And I know Jim is going to talk about this a little bit more in a bit too. So for example, if I have a cider operation, right? And I am going down that list of 60 different uses that are permitted in farm zones. And all I'm doing is growing apples and processing them into cider. I might find the specific use that's called farm product processing. And that's going to be my permit path. I'm just growing apples and processing them to cider by bottling them, selling them, right? Subject to certain standards that are in statute for that use. But if that's not what I want to do, if I also want to have like luncheons and events and things like that, I might go down that list until I find cider business. And that's a specific use that's listed in statute. And so if I have a certain number of acres that are planted in orchard, or I have a long-term contract for apple supply, and I'm producing under a certain volume of cider, then I may pursue that permit path for my business. If that's not what I want to do, if I'm not growing any apples and I just want to, make some cider in my garage and have a tasting room in my garage, I might go further down that list to home occupation and use that as my permitting path approval for my cider business. But actually, if I want to do something much larger, have lots of employees, aggregate apples from the local agricultural area, and have a big cider processing facility and big event facility, then I may then go further down the list and permit my cidery as a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. So there are several different ways. Something as simple as a cider business could be permitted under Chapter 215 in statute. So for the purpose of the biennial Farm and Forest report to the legislature, we have taken a stab at clarifying and rolling up some of those uses. But before I get there, I want to touch on events because this comes up a lot. And events can be, particularly controversial. So a lot of people think that the agritourism events category that is a specific use in Chapter 215 is the way that we permit agritourism events. That's not entirely true. Agritourism events get permitted through that pathway. They also get permitted in conjunction with a farm stand. They can be permitted at wineries, at cideries, at breweries. Events venues are actually getting permitted as home occupations, as commercial activities in conjunction with farm use, as outdoor mass gatherings through a different non-land use temporary use permit approval process by counties for one-off events. And then some events may actually be considered farm uses under the definition of farm use in 215-203. For example, equine schooling shows are considered a farm use. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that when we're talking about agritourism events, there's a whole broad list of ways that can happen and permitting pathways for that. All right, next slide, please. Yes, Commissioner Boyer. Oh, sorry. Board member.
Sorry. So this permitting process, say one fails on one of the categories, can they come back and reapply under a different category?
So that's a very good question, Board Member Boyer. In practice, that happens. And Jim, I
Oh,
know
I'm
has
gonna
a
talk
lot
about it,
to
yeah.
say about this particular subject, because technically, we have as land use practitioners taken the view that that's not supposed to happen. That's not the way it works. But in practice, that does happen.
All the time.
All the time. Yeah. All right. So far, lots of different ways to look at parsing down agritourism. Right. So we submit a report every other year to the legislature that looks at the permit approvals that are happening in farm zones and in forest zones. And this is the graph that's been included in this report. So what you see here is I've taken all of the different bed and breakfast and short-term rental and lodging approvals, and those are at the bottom in red on that graph. And apologies, the colors translated weirdly. I'm not sure. So it's going to be hard to distinguish that from the orange in the graph. So the orange in this graph are all of those different types of event approvals that have been rolled up into one category. That's events, venues, weddings, etc. So the permit approvals that have been reported for that are that orange bar on that slide. The gray bar are all campgrounds and private parks, does not include public parks or public recreational trails. And so some people wouldn't include this in agritourism. In USDA's numbers, they include things like fishing and hunting, which are often permitted as private parks. So we've included that here. And then at the very top in blue are all of the wineries, cideries, and breweries that can have events, and then distilleries and tasting rooms that are approved as home occupations or commercial activities in conjunction with farm use. So when we look at this graph, what we see over time is supports what we're hearing from USDA, that there's been an significant increase in agritourism related revenue, and we've seen an increase in these sort of permit approvals, particularly for alcohol related alcohol related events and facilities, tasting rooms, and winery, cideries, and breweries that blue up there. But also in short-term rentals and bed and breakfasts, we've seen a long-term sort of trend and increase in those permit approvals. We have seen more recently, in the past 2 years, an increase in event and event venue approvals. So you'll see that in the 2020 and 2021 bars. Just a quick note on potential pandemic influence. You will note that there were quite a number of permits approved in 2020. Many of these uses that we're talking about are type 2 uses that require a public process, and so they can take several months for a county to process depending on a jurisdiction. So a lot of the approvals that actually are issued in 2020 may have been applied for in 2019. So it is still early to sort of guess at any impact the pandemic may have had on those approvals until we get the next 2 years of reports, which will be coming out out next fall with a next biennial farm and forest report to the legislature. Okay. Yes.
Question, if I may, Elin Miller for the record. So on the blue bar, and I'm kind of relating back to your previous slide, and also your statement that either things are approved outright versus need to be considered. I had 2 buckets, is what I said. So of that blue bar, do you have any indication of what's the outright, does this statutorily just outright approved versus, or maybe you have another slide on that?
I'm going to talk about it.
Okay.
Jim will talk about it, but yeah, I could pull that out of my data sets right now, but not this moment. We'll wait to hear what Jim says.
Okay.
So the one last thing I'd say before I sum up here is that these trends are not limited to the Willamette Valley. So we are seeing these types of permit approvals all over the state, less so on the coast, which is interesting, but Douglas, Jackson, Josephine, Wasco, Umatilla, Baker, Union, we are seeing these types of permit approvals outside of the areas where we normally think of them, like Yamhill, Marion, Washington, and Hood River, where they've tended to be more controversial, although of course Yamhill County still does lead the state in terms of permit approvals for wineries, cideries, and breweries. All right, next slide. So just to wrap up, when we are looking at how agritourism is evolving across the landscape in Oregon, it's a bit challenging, primarily for 3 reasons. One is that everything I've talked about this morning is what is happening in farm zones. So we track permits that are issued in farm and forest zones. So all of the agritourism development that might be happening adjacent to farm and forest zones in rural residential areas or rural commercial areas, we're not tracking that. We're not, tracking permit approvals for those, but those may certainly have an impact on the surrounding area. The second is there's no standard definition for agritourism. So when we're having these great conversations about agritourism and its impact in the state, we're not all on the same page as to what we're talking about. And then the third big issue is that when we're trying to visualize, what's happening, it's challenging because these things are getting approved in a number of different ways. And so it's kind of hard to parse them out and actually get a good look at what is happening. All right, so that is what I have for today. I think Jim is actually going to expand on a lot of what I touched on here. So I think maybe we'll happy to take questions together after you go through some more details. Yeah. All right, thank
Thanks,
you.
Hillary. One comment to add to Hillary's comments. When you look at the USDA NASS numbers, they look at land in farm use, not by zoning districts. So that could be a chunk of that could not be lands that are actually zoned for exclusive farm use. And that's something that whenever I'm using the statistics, I make sure that people understand. There's a lot of farmland in Oregon that's actually not zoned for farm use. So I can show you areas inside the Portland metro urban growth boundary that's in farm use that's zoned industrial, for example. So NASS doesn't look at zoning, they look at use. So that's basically something I always remind people of when they're using those numbers. So, all right, next slide, please. This is something that is really important. People need to know to understand how the exclusive farm use zone works in Oregon. The way that I always break this out is into 3 categories. Farm use is defined in statutes separately from the rest of the use standards in the exclusive farm use zone. Farm use obviously is permitted outright in an exclusive farm use zone. Having said that, there are court cases that have said that there are situations where farm use is actually a land use decision when there is discretion involved. And if something is a land use decision, then it's subject to appeal and subject to a public process. I won't get into that details a lot, but we've had, for example, cities arguing that they're doing something that's a farm use, and so they were interpreting the law a little differently, and there was a discretion there, and the courts have said that's a land use decision, it's appealable. We can talk about that someday or whatever, but a lot of people try to say that they're farm use so that they don't have to get a permit. That's a dodge that's not uncommon once in a while, and urban jurisdictions tend to try to do that to not have to go through certain permitting processes for utilities, for example. But the main part of the exclusive farm use zone is really, and Hillary called them 2 different buckets. I call them the sub 1 and the sub 2 uses, and both can involve discretion. Sub 1 uses, a lot of people say, are uses that are permitted outright. I don't agree with that. What they are uses that are subject to state law only. Local governments can't put any additional standards onto those. And there are provisions in state law that are discretionary, thus that makes the decision a land use decision and is subject to, going through a public process and the like. And a great example of that would be a utility facility necessary for public service, a city. That's a sub 1 use, permitted, but it's permitted under state law only. The local governments can't put additional standards on that. It still goes through the same process as a sub 2 use, but only against state law. Sub 2 uses are those uses that, and where most of the non-farm uses are that we all recognize or whatever, are subject to state law and any other additional local law that the local zoning code employs onto that. And every county can be a little different there. The other thing to remember about sub 2 uses is they're not mandatory. Counties can just not allow them at all. Whereas sub 1 uses, they have no choice. They have to allow them subject to state law, period. Sub 2 uses, county can say, we don't want golf courses in our county, so we're just not even going to put it in our zoning code. That's why when you see discussions at the legislature about where somebody wants to be regulated, you'll see the utility folks, you'll see the winery folks, and like they wanted to be a sub 1 use so that local governments couldn't put additional standards on them. And so that's always one of the first discussions when we get into something in the legislature in terms of where the legislation should go. Should it be in that sub 1 category or that sub 2 category? So the key to always remember, is it subject to state law only, or is it subject to state law and local government, local regulations? And is there interpretation? Because if there's interpretation, if you're making a discretionary call, then it's a land use decision. It's got to go through a public process. Doesn't necessarily have to go to the county commissioners. It depends on each county, but it's got to go through a public process, and it can be appealed to LUBA, to the Land Use Board of Appeals. That is a real quick down and dirty of how the EFU zone works, and I'll get into some details, more details on agritourism later now. But Chad, it looked like you were going to tee up for a question there.
Well, yeah, I got one burning a little bit. On I'm assuming placement of transmission lines is a sub 1 use. And what state conditions would have to be met?
Well, they would be specifically in the exclusive farm use zone, and energy facility siting, I could take another hour to talk about. So let's set that up and we do have a resolution on that one too, by the way. So let's talk about that later, but they are subject to some specific things. And then when you get into the energy facility siting world, that could be pulled right out of the local process and into the Energy Facility Siting Council, which is a state agency, and they might be doing the review, and we don't even, and it's a whole different ball game there. So next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about this because it's very, very important. All the sub 2 uses under state law are subject to what's called the Farm Impacts Test, 215, 296. Some sub 1 uses are actually subject to the Farm Impacts Test also because the legislature specifically called that out. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the most important provisions in state law for reviewing discretionary uses in the exclusive farm use zone. And there's been some important court decisions of late to define this that I think that are really key and will be even more important in the future. But bottom line, what the Farm Impacts Test basically requires is that before you approve the proposed land use, you've got to determine whether or not the use will force a significant change in accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use, or will not significantly increase the cost of accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest uses. This gets to the crux of most of my right to farm complaints that I get, around the clock and the like, whatever. What will be the impacts of the proposed non-farm use on the surrounding farming and forest operations? And it's really key, and there's a lot of important case law on this. I don't want to dig into it too much, but I did want you to be aware of it. It's something that you're going to hear more and more about since the Supreme Court ruled on it about a year and a half, 2 years ago. Came out of what I call ground zero for case law in the last couple of years, Yamhill County. So let's go to the next slide, please. I broke agritourism into land use categories. I debated whether to go through it on statutory categories. I decided to break it into land use categories. I think it's much more understandable this way. This is the list of land use categories that I use when I'm talking about agritourism land use categories, so to speak. And this is the list, and I'm going to go through them one by one and talk about that. Next slide, please. Okay, farm use. Farm use is, like I said, is defined in state law. It originated actually as a tax definition for property taxation. And there is an element to the definition, and the definition is much longer than this. I just took the first paragraph out of this, but the highlighted sections here are the parts that you could say are related to agritourism. Selling of crops, sale of the sale or the produce of livestock, poultry, fur-bearing animals, or honeybees, or for dairying, and the sale of dairy products or any other agricultural product, marketing of those products, and byproducts. So sale, marketing, and the like, that's all within the definition of farm use. There's other elements of definition of farm use. Probably most key is that is with an intent to make a profit and money. So it's got to be commercial. So somebody that's got 2 horses that they ride and they're saying they've got livestock, if those horses aren't for sale or the like, or they can't argue they're a farm use unless then they can do an agritourism activity, for example. It's got to be commercial, and there's a lot of case law on that. I think, next slide, please. I think it's important to remember that as a farm use, this is permitted outright unless there's discretion in review. So when you look at farm use and you look at agritourism, it'd be things like UPIC, self-service type things, non-developed sales and preparation, like those would all be farm use and thus would really not be subject to much review at the local level, just be permitted outright. That last element up there is very important. This does not include farm stands. Farm stands have a specific category under state law. In fact, this might have happened when I was a county planner. There were so many issues with farm stands being approved as farm uses and not subject to review that the legislature took this up and created a separate category for farm stands and defined what they were. There were grocery stores being cited on farmland under the guise of farm stands, for example, back in the late 70s, early 80s. And it got to be such a hot topic. I remember one farmer talking to me about how can I run a profitable farm stand when right down the road this guy that's not a farmer has got the same thing set up and he's just bringing in produce from distribution warehouses and calling it a farm stand. Those were the kind of things that really got the legislature to decide to define what a farm stand is and how you approve that, and we're going to talk about that in a second. In fact, let's go to the next slide and talk about farm stands. Farm stands, they are a sub 1 use. They're subject to review against state law only. And it involves the sale of the products, the products from the farm and from regional farms. There was a debate on, what about if I want to sell products from, other farms in the area in addition to my farms? And so the legislature said, let's do regional farms. Well, you know what a regional farm is in definition in state law? All farms in the state of Oregon and all counties adjacent to the boundaries of the state of Oregon. So regional from a farm stand is a pretty large situation there. You can sell at a farm stand related items, incidental items, t-shirts, whatever, but it can't exceed more than 25% of the total sales of the farm stand. A farm stand can't include a structure that's designed as an occupancy for a residence or the like. It cannot include structures for public events and such. And farm stands, though, can have events. They are related to that in the definition. And there's much more to it than I've got here. I'm trying to generalize, and we could get into more details later. Specifically, though, and I put this at the end there, the legislature said marijuana cannot be sold at a farm stand. Can't do marijuana. We had people trying to do, early on when the marijuana stuff passed, wanted to do tasting events at farm stands for cannabis. Because we can do it for wine, we can do it for that kind of thing. And believe me, that you wouldn't believe the things that we heard about early on in the cannabis situation. So that's the specifics related to farm stands. Let's go to the next slide, please. Wineries. Hillary pointed out to you that wineries is one of the biggest categories. Wineries are a sub 1 use, so they're subject to state law only. Local governments cannot put additional standards on that. And believe me, that's a point of contention. There's a lot of local governments that are concerned that they can't do more compatibility reviews related to other uses in the farm zone besides just farm use. But that's let's just put it this way, they had a great lobbyist, the winery folks. So that's how that works. Wineries are really, in my consideration of this over and how they developed, they started out as really being about processing. And wineries are really two elements, the processing element of it and the agritourism elements of it, and they've been combined in the state statute. Wineries are authorized on a basis of the production, how many gallons do they produce, and how many acres of vineyards do they have in it. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail here, but this is probably the most detailed section in the exclusive farm use zone in terms of describing state standards for the approval of a land use. So for all the concerns that some people may have wineries, on the other side of the coin, a lot of definitions provided here for wineries that is not provided for other uses in the exclusive farm use zone. And so that is as a key element to that. Let's go to the next slide, please. The statute, unlike any other element of the statute as it relates to agritourism, wineries, it specifically lists the types of things that can be allowed as agritourism related activities. And here's the list. I'll just quickly, sale of wine, wine club activities, tours, open house promotions, marketing of incidental items related to the promotion of the wine, can't proceed 25%, so that's very similar to farm stands. Up to 18 days of agritourism events is built right into the winery provisions here, so they don't have to go through another category. And a bed and breakfast is specifically called out in the statute, may be approved as a home occupation, but so they have to go through a separate review, but it may be approved associated with a winery. Next slide, please.
One quick question, Jim. So this is where you were talking about some of the category one still have additional review. So when you say up to 18 days of ag tourism events licensed by a local government, so for the local tourism events, a winery has to go to the local government?
You have to go and get a license, but it's not reviewed the same way that other events are approved. Okay. And we'll get to that.
Thank you.
So yeah. Now, Hillary said agritourism is not defined in statute. It is in one place. For wineries, agritourism is actually defined in the statute. Agritourism activities is defined for wineries, I had to put that in there, to include outdoor concerts for which admission is charged, educational, cultural, health, or lifestyle events, facility rentals. Doesn't say what those rentals could be for. That's sometimes a big issue. Celebratory gatherings and other events at which the promotion of wine produced in conjunction with the winery is a secondary purpose of the event. That last element has been problematic in some cases. I know of one winery that was basically saying, we're not charging for our weddings that we have out here. We're just charging for our wine. It's the way we sell our wine. Well, the wine was selling for $1,000 a bottle to make up for what they would have charged for to have the wedding event there. So there's always kind of angles here, whatever. And people wonder why state law gets so detailed sometimes. It's because of the ways that it's manipulated out there. And so you have to have better definitions. But agritourism, this is the one place that the term agritourism is actually defined, is in the winery section of the exclusive farm use zone. It is not defined anyplace else for any other elements. Next slide, please. Now, there's one special category in the winery section. This was really good lobbying by a couple of wineries who will remain unnamed, but you'll probably know who they are. If you have 80 acres or more, 50 acres of grapes, and then you own 80 additional acres of that, and you produced over 150,000 gallons on 3 of the last 5 years, you can have a restaurant at your winery. Restaurants are not allowed at wineries. That you can have taste, you can have food associated with your winery, but you can't have a menu. You can't have a restaurant. But there are 2 wineries in the state of Oregon that actually have restaurants. And that's actually in state statute. And there are a lot of people that were upset that why do they get to do something and the rest of us don't? So that's one of the issues that we have with agritourism is unequal application of the law and the like. And if you look at the board in their resolution related to non-farm developments in general and the like, one of the things you guys talk about is that all agriculture should be treated the same. This is an example of why that kind of thing comes up. I get a lot of, because a lot of the sub 2 uses are not mandatory, I will get calls from farmers complaining, well, they can do this in Yamhill County, but we can't do it in Washington County. Well, that's a local decision a lot of times because the county chose not to allow for this specific use or not. But when statute says somebody gets something and somebody else doesn't get something, that usually gets really upset. When I get the call about Yamhill versus Washington County, and I get these kind of calls a lot, I go, that's a policy question for your local county board. because state law does authorize the ability to do this. You're enabled to do this, but it's a local decision whether it is allowed or not. And so a lot of times that's the consideration that needs to be taken into account when you look at some of these uses, especially that category, that sub 2 use kind of thing. That's a local discretionary thing for counties. Now, when you look at the large winery thing, the restaurant, you still have to apply the farm impacts test, so that becomes discretionary all of a sudden. So they're going to have to go through the review process. And outdoor concerts and likes are allowed. The issue with this is, of course, the two wineries that meet these standards, they already had those facilities in place, so they were grandfathered in, so they never went through any review process. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this gets to something that Hillary was talking about. Gee, if you can't get approved through all these criteria and the like in the winery statute, you can still try to get it approved as a commercial use in conjunction with farm use. So you can go venue shopping. Can't do it one way, you can do it another way. And this is not the only use that can do this, but the winery folks were able to get in the statute specifically. It actually states in the winery section, we can also get approved as a commercial use in conjunction with farm use. So it's not just, skirting around looking for the law. It actually says they can do it. So. Next slide, please. Cider businesses and farm breweries. So coming down the road, cider gets popular, beer gets popular, and Dave Loesch back here is one of the best brewer makers I know of. So, you want to talk about that sometime, talk to Dave. Cideries and breweries can be established based on some similar things to wineries in terms of production and acres of orchard or acres of hops associated with it. And they can do the same agribusiness or agritourism related businesses as the wineries, except there's not a provision for like the large winery for restaurants. This is basically two businesses come along and say, hey, wineries get to do this. Why can't we do the same thing? And so the cider folks got authorized, and then later on the beer folks got authorized. And makes sense. They're all producing an alcoholic beverage from a farming product, and so in this case, they're kind of getting treated the same, and that was the issue there. And we hear it about other things. The marijuana folks said, well, we want to be able to have these same kind of things, and that's kind of where the legislature drew the line and said, no, we're not going to go that far. But that was the argument that was made. If you can make alcoholic beverages from farm products, and have the tasting rooms and all the activities associated with it, why can't we do that with cannabis also? So, but the cannabis laws do not allow that right now. So, next slide. Let's switch gears to lodging. There's various ways that lodging can be approved in the farm zone. This can be very manipulative also. Most of these are sub 2 uses, so they're again subject to also local standards. But in the exclusive farm use zone, you can do room and boarding for up to 5 unrelated persons. So it's in a house, you do room and boarding and the like. So some bed and breakfast related type things are approved through this room and boarding element sometimes. Campgrounds, hunting and fishing preserves, Hillary talked about that. They can be allowed as a sub 2 use again. So counties can say be more restrictive or have more standards, and most of them do, especially as it relates to things like health, safety, and welfare issues, fire protection, those kinds of things. These are all required. These 2 uses still require the application of the farm impacts test. So if it's going to impact surrounding farming operations and it can't be mitigated through the implication of conditions, then it should not be authorized by the local government. Now, these last 3 uses are different. I wanted to list them here for lack of another place to stick them. Destination resorts. The process is very complicated, very detailed. It's almost like doing a zone change, having a specific spot put on the map for a zone change subject to review and the like. I really first dove into getting involved in some real controversial land use issues when I was at DLCD with the agricultural community in Oregon as it related to destination resorts. And it was in Lauren's home country in Jefferson County. So destination resorts is a very touchy issue to the ag industry. It's not just about compatibility with land use, but it's usually got a lot to do with water availability also. But it's usually a huge footprint, like a zone change. You're creating a whole zone just for that proposal on there. And state law is very protective of farmland in the destination resort rules. High value farmland is off limits. There's requirements in terms of how far away you have to be from cities and the like. And so it's very, very detailed. But you don't see a new destination resort every day, but they do get proposed once in a while, especially in Central Oregon. But we see them on the coast once in a while, but there are specific things related to that. There's a specific provision for dude ranches in Eastern Oregon. I'm not even going to get into that detail. I only know of one in the, 30 some years that I've been working with the exclusive farm use, so I only know of one that's actually went through this process. So it's not something that happens a lot. And then short-term rentals. The term short-term rental is not in state statute, but it is a real problem in Oregon agriculture. And what basically is, this is VRBO, Airbnb, Vacasa, all these things where a single-family dwelling is basically put up for lodging and charged on a per night basis. And this photo that I've got on here that you look at, that was approved as a farm dwelling. I don't know too many farmers that would live in something like this. It's got over 8 bedrooms in it. The rooms are rented out, and what happens is something gets approved as a dwelling, or it's in a pre-existing dwelling. Somebody buys that, and then it's put into as a short-term rental. And I think that Mike McCarthy has signed up for public comment later on from Hood River County, and I bet you that he's going to talk about the issues in Hood River County where the houses are being bought up by non-farm folks out in the farm country and being turned into short-term rentals. There's 2 real big issues with that. One, that housing is no longer available for farm workers and the like on the farms. And second, the land values are escalating to the point in terms of that farmers can't compete to buy that 40-acre tract that happens to have a house on it, but also has orchard on it, because they want it for a short-term rental. And so this is a agritourism related event in a lot of the ag areas that's really not been taken into account in regulation. And I think we're going to hear more about this as we go on and looking at the codes, but it's become very problematic, especially in where agriculture and high-end tourism collide, so to speak. And Hood River County right now tends to be ground zero, but we're seeing it happen more and more around the state. Next slide, please. Okay, agritourism and commercial events or activities. About, when has it been now, Hillary? 6 or 8 years ago, the legislature added a new category to the exclusive farm use zone, and it was called agritourism and commercial events or activities. The first thing that I want to point out here is there's no definition here. So it talks about all these events and activities and the like, and the legislature did not define what an event or a tourism or an activity is. And so it's in constant debate what can be authorized through these provisions. Agritourism or commercial events must be related, all of them, and I'm going to go through four so different ways you can go through this. But all must be related and be supportive of agriculture, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Here's a key. This section of the statute is optional. Local government doesn't have to even enable for these to happen. And believe it or not, there are some counties that have not enabled the ability to do these agritourism events and the like. But this is optional. So if a county wanted to, they could just say, we're not going to authorize these things. And there's a few counties that still have not put this into their code. So that is something that's really, really important. When people complain about this to me, I go talk to your board. If you really don't want to have these things, the county does have an ability to do more here than what state law says. So let's go through these. There's 4 types of ways to authorize them, and I'm going to go through those one by one. So let's go through the next set of slides. The next slide, please. So first, I wanted to talk about what I said. All agritourism events must be determined to be necessary to support the commercial farm uses in the area. The commercial farm uses in the area. And what the county or what the court said on this, and this is really important, and we've had several court cases of late come out to really address some of these issues. And these court cases, in effect, are establishing new laws that are not in the law, but they're interpreting law. And basically what the court said necessary to support is the county must find that the events are essential in order to maintain the existence of either the commercial farm or the commercial agricultural enterprises in the area. Essential. So there's got to be that nexus to commercial agriculture. Yamhill County case, by the way, Barbara. You're going to see a couple of Yamhill County cases here. It's like I said, it's ground zero. But Marion County is picking up and catching up real fast on that. So, next slide, please. Incidental and subordinate. The other thing that the statute talks about for all of these things is that a use must be incidental and subordinate to the existing commercial farm use of the tract. This means that it's more than an accessory use, and it reflects that the predominant use on the property, in light of a lot of different factors, including intensity, economic value, nature, and the like, is agriculture first and tourism second. So it's got to be incidental and subordinate. Again, another Yamhill County case. What we had was somebody arguing, well, gee, my brewery only takes up 10,000 square foot on my 40-acre parcel, so it's incidental and subordinate because it only takes up a small footprint, but it was making 80% of the value of their operation. And the court said, no, that's not incidental and subordinate, that's the predominant use here. And so that's what this is getting at here in terms of what is an agritourism activity. Next slide, please. So let's go through the types that can be approved. The legislature set up what's called a single event or activity in a calendar year. So you can get approval for just one event. Go through a licensing type process with your local government, get approval for one event. And this is a popular approach to types things. Somebody that maybe wants to do some kind of harvest event or whatever, and they just do it once a year, and if they don't do it constantly or whatever, this is a very good way to go through that. There's some limitations, as you can see on the list here. Can't exceed 72 consecutive hours, 500 people, 250 vehicles. Hours of operation and the like can be regulated by the local government. They can put, health, safety, welfare type things on it. So that's the first one, a single event or activity in a calendar year. Next slide, please. And I talked about incidental and subordinate, but I wanted to put this up here again for that last bullet. The tail doesn't wag the dog. So what is the primary use kind of thing? And it's really important when you're looking through all of these. Next slide, please. Then there's the expedited single event license. This is really kind of focused on one quick little thing. You're not going to do it every calendar year, one event a calendar year. This is just one expedited event. Something comes up. You can see the limitations here. It has to be, incidental, subordinate, just like all of them, that all of these uses do or whatever. But it's much smaller in focus. It's expedited because it's much smaller, less impact. 100 persons or 50 vehicles. Can't start until 8 a.m. in the morning. Can't go past 10 p.m. You've got to have a certain track size to make sure there's buffers and the like, and you can put health, safety, and welfare type conditions on it. So that's the second category of events and the like. Next slide, please. Multiple events. This is how you can authorize up to 6 events per year. A lot of the same standards that we talked about. The farm impacts test comes into play here, so it's basically subject to review and goes through a land use process, so it won't impact the surrounding farming operations. And this is something that's pretty cool. And I remember the debate on this. You've basically got to do what's called the cumulative impacts test, and that is, the proposed development in association with other agritourism events and the like in the area materially altered the stability of the land use pattern of the area. So what would be the cumulative impact of this agritourism event and other agritourism events in the area on agricultural operations? And so you got somebody's proposing a wedding venue, and there's already 5 of them out there next to this guy's orchard, and this is just the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. It shouldn't be approved. But this is the first place where the cumulative impacts test comes in. And that's a really, really big issue in agriculture more and more, is what is the cumulative impact of all the non-farm uses together on farming operations in an area. So that's really an important standard they got here, and I remember the debate on that also. I think that in exchange for the first two that we talked about being a little quicker, than the cumulative impact test was applied in here after this, because it's now you're starting to get these properties that'll have multiple events throughout the year. Then the next slide, please. And then there's the last category. If you can't get approved through those other three, you can go through this. Basically, it's the catch-all category is what I call it. You've got to comply with all the requirements that we previously discussed for the 6 events. Plus, it's got to meet the minimum parcel size of the zone. So if it's an EFU, exclusive farm use 80 zone, you've got to have at least 80 acres. Or if it's a 40 zone, you've got to have at least 40 acres of the like. So you're not going to see them on these small hobby farm type parcels, for example. Can't exceed more than 18 events in a year, and it's subject to review by the local government every 4 years. So you got to go through a review process to make sure you're complying with all the conditions that have been imposed for health, safety, and welfare and the like. Now that was real quick for a section of state statute that's really long, but that's the new event statute that was put into play several years back and the like. And I've been surprised it's being used, but I thought it would be used more actually. People instead are going through commercial uses in conjunction with farm use and home occupations and kind of avoiding this. And I think it's because some of the counties also have chosen not to use it. So anyway, so stay tuned on that. Next slide, please. Then there's outdoor mass gatherings. This has history in the activities at Rajneeshpuram. I actually was working for Wasco County during these days, so I know this law really well. The Rajneeshis would have what was called the World Festival, and there would literally be 10,000 people out there. And this was not really regulated any way or whatever. So the legislature basically created what was called the Mass Gathering Statute, and it relates to an assembly of 3,000 people or more. And it's like for a one-day festival or a weekend festival or the like. I think, when we had the solar thing go through a couple of years ago, there were some mass gathering permits done for these types of things. Supposed to be held primarily in open spaces, so like a big rock concert or a big, solar viewing or the like or whatever. And you do need to get a county permit for this, but it is not a land use permit. It's a separate part of statute. It's not in the EFU zone. It applies to all lands, whether you're farm use, forest use, urban growth boundary, whatever. This applies across the board. But it is a way that some agritourism related events have been approved in the past. Think of the big rock festival or the country music festival that used to be down in Brownsville, and then Marion County denied it because of all the issues. And like they went through a mass gathering permit process and had a public hearing on that type of thing. Next slide, please. Home occupations. Hillary talked about this. This is one of the, in my opinion, one of the larger loopholes in state law related to approving uses in the exclusive farm use zone. Historically, home occupations were supposed to really be focused on somebody working out of their house or in their garage or whatever for, they're a CPA or a lawyer or a beauty salon or whatever, and they were working in their home and the like. It is evolved into much, much more. And it's probably something that I believe that the Land Conservation and Development Commission will ultimately be looking at, because they get complaints about this all the time. And it's not just a problem in the exclusive farm use zone, it's a problem in a lot of zones for more than just agritourism events. But it is one of the venues that agritourism folks use to try to get approval of things, especially if they can't get it approved through another process. Home occupations are not supposed to employ more than 5 full-time people. So the ruse here has been that they'll just apply a bunch of part-time people and just keep bringing them through the process. It's supposed to be operated substantially in the dwelling or other buildings normally associated with uses permitted in the zoning district. You would not believe the uses I've seen proposed to be cited in barns that have nothing to do with agriculture, but they're there. It's not supposed to reasonably interfere with other land uses permitted in the district. So here the compatibility review is not just for agriculture, but it could be rural residential. It could be compatible with other uses that are allowed in the zones. And in the EFU zone, you have to apply the farm impacts test. Remember, the home occupation section in state statute applies to all county zoning districts, not just the EFU zone. So it's allowed in the EFU zone, it's allowed in the rural residential zone, it's allowed in the rural industrial zone, it can be allowed or whatever. It's only in the EFU zone that you apply the farm impacts test. Otherwise, it's just the other standards that I'm talking about here. Home occupations are not well defined. It's this definition question again. And thus, it's one of these catch-all venues where people go venue shopping. If we can't get it approved one way, we'll get it approved another. Next slide, please. And the other catch-all is the commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. And this is an interpretation issue as much as a catch-all, because I think if it was applied correctly, some of the problems would go away. But if a county's not called on it and they're just running things through here, it can be problematic. The farm impacts test applies here for a commercial activity in conjunction with farm use. A CACFU, as Hillary calls them, I've never called them that, but that's what the DLCD term is, so I put it up here, whatever. They're required to provide products and services that are essential to the practice of agriculture. Essential to the practice of agriculture. Remember, there was that court case I talked about that's specific to that. The activity must be exclusively or primarily a customer or supplier of farm use. So you can see where we're starting. These were focused on things like farm implement dealers, fertilizer dealers, welding fabrications, providing services to the agricultural industry. But boy, is it broadened out into a lot of other things, and that's one of the issues. There must be a direct connection between the proposed land use and area agriculture. That is the case law under some very long running cases out of Clackamas County. Goes back to probably when I was a county planner. So, but it's not being applied directly in a lot of cases, and so we see some strange things get approved as commercial activities in conjunction with farm use. But the whole idea was these are services to commercial agriculture. The people that you're all used to dealing with, going to get your farm chemicals, getting your parts for your machinery, getting some repairs done, that type of thing. So next slide, please. So let's really quickly talk about some of the issues that I see, and I've already kind of touched on these. Definitions, and not only definitions in terms of what a use is, but in the context of what it's used. Wineries do have a definition of agritourism, but no, there is no definition of agritourism anyplace else. It's going to be, definitions are a big problem in a lot of zoning codes. You'll have a term that's not defined in the like or whatever, and so that leaves a lot to interpretation. And the problem with that is ultimately it ends up in court, and it just slows things down and like. And so the more objective and definitive you can get, the better. And that's a lot of reasons why land use law has become more and more detailed and long. It's because we're trying to define some of these things, because otherwise they're ending up all over the place in terms of process, in terms of how long it takes to get something through, in terms of what can and can't be authorized and under what standards. And it just leads to what some people have related to me as an equity issue. That it happens this way here, but it doesn't happen this way there. And in a world where you've got competition and like, we should all be working under the same rules, is the comment that I'll hear a lot. Venue shopping, you've heard me talk about that before. What's the easiest way for us to go through, and how can we get this approved? I was always taught in land use classes and the like, that if a use is specifically called out someplace and defined, that's how you authorize it. You can't approve it in another way. That's not how it's been working. So an event is authorized through the event statutes that we talked about, whatever. They can't make it through that way, so they go over and try to get it approved as a home occupation. Lawyers have told me, well, the event stuff's over here. You can't go over here and try to approve it this way, but it happens all the time. And I think that's going to have to be cleared up, or, maybe the commission's going to have to specifically say, if you want to get approval of a farm stand, this is the only way you get approval of a farm stand. If you want to get maybe that's going to have to be stated. That's why I think the winery folks, when you look at the winery code, it actually says in their code that if you can't get approved this way, you can go through the commercial use and activity in conjunction with farm use. It doesn't say that anyplace else. So by implication, you could also argue that you shouldn't be able to do that because the legislature only gave one type of land use that ability, but that's not how it works. So that is a big issue. Uneven application, I've talked about that a lot. You know, one county does it one way, another county does it another way. One land use can go one way, but the other land use can't. That's always an issue, but there's also usually, there many times are good policy reasons why that happens too. So there has to be a discussion better of that and outline why. Is it really uneven, or was there a real policy reason why we're doing it one way here and another way there? You know, some counties wish to be more restricted. They may have more things going on that are problematic. They may be a more urban county versus a more rural county, even though they both have farm zoning. And so they obviously have different issues going on. So I just think when I get that question a lot of times from the farming community, first thing I ask them is, you know, what's the context? You know, Washington County is different than Wasco County. And so there may be real legitimate local policy reasons why they do that, but we need to have those discussions so that people understand that it's you know, we talk about equity a lot nowadays on all kinds of issues. Well, that comes up in the application of law also. So, and then enforcement. Counties tend to enforce things based on complaints. And people are afraid to complain because they don't want their name attached to it or whatever. So a lot of times, cumulatively, these things just go on, and they're violating the conditions that were put into place for very good health, safety, and welfare reasons or the like, and enforcement isn't happening there. And so that's really a long-term issue that we have to talk about in terms of how can the state help local governments in terms of the enforcement of these codes. How you know, can we make things much more objective so that there's less interpretation in terms of the enforcement of codes and like? But it's a real issue, you know, and it's changed dramatically over time. You know, when I was a county planner, enforcement was just routine. We had a tickler file, we check everything out. Now counties enforce based on complaints. We did reviews every year and the like. And I'm not saying that one way's wrong and one way's right. Things have just changed based on the conditions, smaller planning staffs, more responsibilities, all kinds of things. But when you talk to the general public, or you talk to the people that have to live next to these things, enforcement is important, and it's a real issue. So with that, we'll go to the next slide, and I'll just end here. And Hillary and I'd be happy to answer any questions or have any discussion you'd like to have. So, and I think I'm a little late, so.
We will have break at this time. Right. Yeah, I would like to hear if we have some questions for Jim and Hillary.
Barbara Boyer. So in regards to enforcement, that's code, but how is the 25% tracked? Like, there's enforcement there, the 25% sales. Any idea on how that is tracked and the enforcement on something like that?
That is a very good question, board member Boyer. So some of these standards are very difficult to enforce going forward, like the income related standards, where if 25% of your income is, is coming from those incidental and subordinate sort of activities. So, I often recommend to counties that they consider applying additional conditions of approval around some things that can act as future enforcement mechanisms. There are some provisions. I think one of the things that I like about the guest ranch standards, for example, that I think you call them dude ranches in Eastern Oregon, is that there's some built-in mechanisms there that require an annual report would be submitted to the county documenting income from that ranch and sparsing it out between, what's coming from the guest ranch activities and what's coming from their livestock operation. So there are ways to, provisions that can be implemented that might make enforcement easier going forward. But right now, if you're asking like about the farm stand standards, that's a sticky issue. Do you want to say something else on that?
No, that's.
I have a question, Luisa Santamaria. Now, you mentioned about all these issues that things are still important. What could you do for definitions? That is something that has to be a key element to guide everybody.
Jim Johnson. One of the things, and I've thought about this a lot, is planners are the great plagiarists. There are a lot of people out there that have a lot of experience with this that are smarter than us. I remember when I was working on when we changed the winery standards and the like. I just went down and I talked to Santa Barbara County. I talked to Napa County. I talked to several, and they've got some very detailed codes. We can go looking for those types of things and talk to people that have had a lot of experience with that. I mean, one of the first things I hear from people is that we don't want to end up like Napa County. Napa County didn't want to end up like Napa County also, and they now allow no new wineries. They've just slammed the door, and their code is very much more very restrictive. We can learn from that. But I also think it's just a matter of we all sitting down and starting to talk about what are the elements, what are the elements of this that we all agree to, and then write that into the definition. I mean, the part of the problem is we just don't have a definition. It's not that we couldn't develop one, we just don't have one. And I think it wouldn't be as difficult as you think, especially when we've done it in the winery section, for example. But Louisa, the first place I'd go is see what other people have done first, and then see how that would work in the Oregon program or the like. So.
Mm-hmm. If I may add that we do have a model code. It's not mandatory. It's an example that's out there for counties to look at, to implement. It's out of date at this point in time. I think it was drafted through an effort in 2012. It needs to be updated. But in that model code, we do have a suggested definition for agritourism that we have provided that counties can consider adopting into their ordinances if they choose to do so.
And I would add one other thing. We have an awful lot of court decisions out there that have defined a lot of these terms.
Mm-hmm.
Those court decisions need to be codified into the law. Right now, you'd be surprised how many times a county will call me up and ask me about a specific thing, and I'll say, well, you're supposed to be interpreting X, Y, and Z according to the Supreme Court decision in Stop the Dump versus Yamhill County. They didn't even know the case existed. But if the language in that decision gets codified into the administrative rule, for example, the LCDC administrative rule, it's right there for them to see it. They're supposed to be applying it because the courts say that's how it's interpreted, but a lot of people don't know that the court decision even exists. So the elements of that court decision need to be codified into law. That would be one way to solve some of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Chair Miguel Lopez. So Jim, why isn't that being brought up, or why isn't it being updated better?
Jim Johnson, it is. And Barbara may want to talk about this, or Hillary, but LCDC at their last meeting had a discussion about this. They basically agreed with Hillary's report that they need to create a work group to start to address some of these issues. Brian and I are on that work group. Barbara's representing LCDC on that work group. There's several other farmers on that work group, some county planners and like, and we will have our first meeting coming up pretty soon. Mm-hmm. We're going to be talking more than just about agritourism. There's some other issues in the exclusive farm use zone also, so good question. This is very timely that we have this discussion and that we be working on this resolution, because I'm going to be using those resolutions in my work representing the department and the board in this discussions with LCDC.
I got a question, Chad Allen. What's the?
Can you speak in your microphone?
What's the position on the? This isn't really agritourism, but it's kind of related. It's certainly in recreational use through farm use zoning, and that's the conversion of our belt lines to rails and trails.
Yeah, Jim Johnson. We've had this recently. The most recent issue of this was in Yamhill County with the Rails to Trails project. The trail was a conditional use permit. They had to apply the farm impacts test, the 215-296 standard. The use was authorized by the county, but when it got to the courts said no, that violated the farm impacts test, and it was overturned. The thing about transportation related facilities, and I use that term loosely related because that's a trail was considered a transportation facility instead of a recreational facility. You also have to apply the transportation rules under LCDC, and there are some protection elements in there related to protection of farmland and the like, but they need to be a little better defined in my opinion, and that's something we'll probably discuss also in this work group. But trails, I've probably worked on 7 or 8 different trails over the years in my career. It's almost as controversial to the farm community as some of the energy facility siting things that we've been seeing of late. I mean, you're basically introducing people out into a working landscape, and on that Yamhill proposal, for example, pesticides was a big issue there because you were basically putting the public right smack through the middle of some hazelnut orchards, for example. It is an important issue. I remember discussing with you the Salmonberry Trail thing, and I've got to, in that situation to the if I remember right, they rerouted it a little bit to get away from some of those. But on the other side of the coin, you've got the situation in with your dairy, and everybody will see this tomorrow, where the pedal car things or whatever are going on the railroad tracks, and that was never really approved as a land use, I think, yet it's impacting your operations. So it is an issue. Recreational use. Recreational uses can be that are not agritourism related, let alone agritourism related ones, can be very problematic because you're basically introducing people come out into an agricultural area for a recreational purpose, and they see all this quote unquote open space land. And you might want to ask Mike McCarthy when he comments later about some of the horror stories I've heard about people out in the orchards in Hood River County where they think they can just walk right through the middle of them and they just sprayed the day before or something. So.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a really interesting presentation. I'm sure we have more questions, but I want to continue on our schedule today, and we have a public comment. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I think John and Hillary maybe will be around, and you can make more questions after.
Happy to.
Thank you very much for your
much.
presentation.
Good job.
Okay, we're going to continue with the public comment at this time. And we have one person that wants to do a public comment. It is Mike McCarthy. Is he online? Is he? Can you see?
I don't think he is.
No? All right, but we have 2 people that have signed today. And David Lush. Okay.
Thank you, Board Chairman and members being able to speak. Dave Losh, USDA NAS, Oregon State Stat. I gave Carla some copies of the press release from our latest crop report, so you can see how some of the crops are doing in both Oregon and the Northwest. Of note is the wheat yields have been dropping. We start forecasting wheat production for the Northwest as well as the rest of the country in May, and each month the yields have dropped. We are going to do a survey with a bigger sample. It's going to be our September agricultural survey, and that will provide us better estimates. And that'll be going from September 1st to 15th, and then results will be released September 29th. Couple other things to note. It looks like it's a good hay crop year. And you can see some of the other commodities as well that's important to Oregon and the Northwest. So I just wanted to kind of let you see some of the things that we're doing. We also, cherries were mentioned before. I went back and took a look at 2021, 22, and 23 for cherries, just to give you an idea of the different states and the amount of production. So in 2022, California, Oregon, and Washington all were down significantly from the previous year, from 2021. And in 2023, we've forecasted, for example, California at 80,000 tons of cherries, Oregon is at 51,000, and Washington is at 240,000 tons. So just a little perspective on the size of the crops in the different states and their impact. Just a couple other things to note: our census of agriculture. We continue in the region to look at the data. When we first bring things in, data, we'll take a look at an individual record, and then as we proceed in our analysis, we'll look at that record in comparison, like with the other wheat farms or other dairies, and take a look at how all the data fits. We're doing our data analysis in going towards our publication date of February 2024. So we'll be releasing some demographic and some higher level data. Of note, NASS census data. People always ask me, why should I report? The Pacific Northwest Waterways Association just came out with their Lower Snake River impact report, and NASS census data was used to show the value of the counties both in Oregon and Washington impacts of the proposal to remove the dams. So that puts a finite number on the impact to farmers. Upcoming reports, we've got a cash rents by county that will be released on August 28th. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I think we have another public comment, so thank you, Dave. Grace Holmes? Is Grace? Oh, Greg Holmes.
Yes.
Just a reminder, we have 3 minutes allocated.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair Santa Maria, members of the board, for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Greg Holmes. I am the Working Lands Program Director for 1000 Friends of Oregon. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we've been around for almost 50 years now, and we work within the land use program, working with Oregonians to build livable communities while protecting our farm, forest, and ranch lands and open spaces. I'm here in support of you adopting the resolutions that are before you today, 295 and 310, as presented. I just have a few extra comments about 310. I submitted written testimony to you in June on this topic when it came up. I want to thank Jim and Hillary for a very informative presentation today. And just say the land use program, Hillary has some great data. Land use program has done a good job of preserving, keeping agricultural land preserved for agriculture. It's really generally pretty good at addressing the issues that it's specifically designed to address, but there are some issues that either weren't part of the original discussion or that have changed over the years. Climate change just wasn't a thing in 1972, so it's not really addressed in the program very well. As Hillary pointed out, the way that agritourism has been developing has changed pretty significantly over the last 10 years, and it's also not addressed adequately. The problem is, again, in definitions. At one end of the scale, we have people that are trying to get activities approved under the term agritourism, but we're not all talking about the same thing. At one end of the scale, we have things that are very clearly related to and supportive of agriculture. There are those things that are incidental and subordinate that Jim was talking about. At the other end of the scale, we have things that people are trying to approve in the name of agritourism that the only relationship they have to agriculture at all is they're happening on exclusive farm use zoned land. Otherwise, they're just commercial activities, businesses. And those are fine, but they don't belong on agricultural land. So part of the definition, again, or part of the problem, again, is this lack of definitions on what activities are appropriate and how those activities get permitted. And when we define agritourism, I think this scale may be looking more like this instead of having some of these things that some people are talking about as agritourism right now. We presented a report to you in 2020 that we created called Death by a Thousand Cuts, which explained the implications and the impacts of a lot of these activities. I know there's been a lot of turnover with the board. I'd be happy to come back and talk to you about this. I will make sure Carla has a link to this that she can distribute to you all. Your resolution, the place to define all of these things is not through case law. It's through getting the regulations in place properly. So your resolution is very simple, really. LCDC has the authority to correct a lot of these problems through administrative rules. You're saying we think agritourism has a place. Let's get it defined. Let's get all of these pathways to how you approve things defined. It's a win-win situation for everybody. It'll save a lot of people a lot of heartache. So thank you for your time, for your attention, and I look forward to working with LCDC as they work through some of these issues and use that resolution that you approve to advocate that body. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll do a 5-minute break. Yes. I think we're gonna take 5 or 10 minutes. Oh, 5?
Quick break.
Yes, 5 minutes break. We are behind a little bit, but let's take a break. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Look at projector.
Oh,
So my card is kind of malleable. It's not wet, it's just
not as,
not as firm and rigid as it could.
yeah. At least you didn't fry my computer.
Just past us. What's the British bar? Why do they have a sit down instead of outside?
Permanently sticking out, or we'll go through a, maybe it's just to go
It has
through
these
a.
parts that stick out on the end, and so it seems to, and it has holes on it, like it would be mounted, which means the buttons
But
would
I
be on
think
the
it's,
wall
no, I
side.
think it would be mounted this way because of where the bracket is. So the switch would be on top and that would like be under a cabinet.
Oh, so it's supposed to be
Okay, we're going to continue with our meeting. Please join us.
I've got
Okay.
What should I do? I already called. Hello, please.
Eric.
The members of the board, please join us to continue with our meeting. Thank you. Thank you, Ilmi. Thank you, Miguel. Oh, this is the thingy. Oh, yeah, yeah. This is my opportunity. Chad. Who else? Brian. Oh.
Where's Brian?
I know, that's really.
I think Brian's outside.
That came quick.
He was in a phone call. Okay, thank you. Huh? Yeah, he said that it's okay, but at least the members.
Very large.
Should I continue?
We're gonna start without Lauren. I don't know if you lost
Brian and Chad.
Can all board members please come back to their seats? Chad?
Do you need a man voice to be? Thank you, Miguel.
Yeah, we'll start without him.
All right, we're going to continue with our meeting, and the next item in our agenda is the interagency project to update Oregon's integrated water resources strategy. I'm going to call Crystal Greenell for this from the Oregon Water Resource Department.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Board. So, yes, my name is Crystal Grinnell. I am the Integrated Water Resources Strategy Specialist, and I have put together today a presentation. So we do have the screen over there showing some slides. So essentially what I'm here today to discuss is the update to the state's Integrated Water Resources Strategy. And so the slides that I'll go through here, we'll talk a little bit more about the history and the background on that, and then the project that we currently have right now to update that document. So next slide, please. All right, so the agenda that I'll run through, and we'll do a quick version of this, so I apologize if I'm speaking quickly because I do want to get us back on schedule. So I will do a quick introduction of what the IWRS is. I'll talk through the project outline and discuss what we've done for outreach and engagement over the last 6 months. And then I will go through a little bit of the IWRS content. That's where we'll probably shorten the presentation today. We won't do a deep dive there. And then I want to leave a little bit of time for questions and discussion at the end. So we got about, I think I'll target this at a half an hour here for all of that, including the discussion. So next slide, please. So the whole purpose of the Integrated Water Resources Strategy is just acknowledging that we have so many different partners in the state that touch water. So regarding water management, we've got at least 18 state agencies, at least 10 federal agencies, 9 sovereign tribes, many local governments and utilities, and of course the public as well that is also using water. So a lot of players involved in water in the state. And so the need for this was acknowledged. Let's go to the next slide, please. Back in 2009, there was a House bill acknowledging that we needed some kind of a strategy to coordinate all of the work happening with all of these different bodies. And so that House bill was converted into statute. So that statute will be revised actually very soon based on some changes that came about in the 2023 legislature. And but currently it does outline that the Oregon Water Resources Department is the department that is charged with leading the development of this strategy. So in terms of just developing the strategy and putting it together, but with the help of other folks as well. So other agencies, the public, stakeholders, tribes, everyone is involved in having some input in that. So those are the things that are laid out in that statute. Just wanted to note right now, that statute does say that it should be updated every 5 years. And so that's why I'm here. We're updating that document. We are a year behind. The last one was done in 2017. And just with this last legislative session, that update frequency has changed now to closer to 8 years or up to 8 years. So we can do it more frequently than that. So just wanted to share that it won't be that we're not talking about the IWS for 8 years after this. We will be talking about it just as far as like a significant update to that document. It will not be required until 8 years from now. We will also be required now to do biennial progress reports, which has not been something that has been done. So next slide, please. Just a little bit about the integrated water resource strategy, how it's used. So it is a almost 200-page document. It is used in various ways. It has a lot of information in it about different programs and different agencies. And it also has some information in there. Really, like, it all boils down to recommended actions for helping to improve our water situation in Oregon and helping to meet our water needs. So that's what a lot of people are referencing in there. There are 51 recommended actions. And so it's helpful when you're thinking about budgeting, state agencies specifically are thinking about budgeting and planning their workloads. They can reference those recommended actions, and also in terms of legislative asks as well. Those are very valuable in that regard. And then really how this strategy is intended to function, and it is described within the strategy itself. It states that these are the recommended actions that will help us meet our water needs as a state, but it's really up to individual agencies to create work plans out of this strategy. And that's how the real work gets done on this. So I say that to just give folks a sense that this is a really large topic, of course, very complex, large umbrella, and it is intended to be a strategy. It's not going to lay out exactly what we need to do day by day. That happens after this. So just in terms of scale of information, that's important context. Next slide, please. And I just mentioned a bit earlier, 2009 was when the House bill was passed, that just acknowledging that we needed such a thing. It took 3 years to develop the first IWRS. So in 2012, we got our first integrated water resources strategy, and on schedule with the required 5-year update. That happened in 2017. So we've had 2 previous versions, and we're currently working on this third update right now. Next slide, please. The schedule that we have right now. So the timeline for this update is the first half of 2023 has been spent designing and implementing the public outreach and engagement portion of the project. So May and June were really the bulk of that public outreach and engagement, where we had some public meetings. I do have a slide here that shows a few things that we did specifically, but the key here is that now we're shifting and we're pivoting into the draft development mode. So we've done our outreach and engagement. We're doing the draft development this summer. We want to put a public draft out in October, so public review and comment can happen in October. We'll take those comments back, and that will also be our window as well for agencies to review as well. And then we'll take those comments back, create another version, and release that hopefully in January for another review and comment window in early 2024. And then the final piece to that puzzle is that the Water Resources Commission is the commission that adopts that document. So in the process of all of these updates, it's important that I and my fellow integrated water resources strategy interagency project team are updating folks about what is happening on this update, and everyone knows that this is coming at the end of the day, and everyone's having some input on it. But at the end of the day, it is the Water Resources Commission that adopts the document. Next slide, please. Just so you know who is working most closely on this draft, we've got an interagency project team of 5 different agencies. So it's Water Resources Department, it's kind of leading this, and then we also have representatives from Department of Ag, DEQ, Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I do want to note that that is new this time around. In 2012 and 2017, those 2 versions did not have the small interagency project team did not include DLCD. And so that is a new effort that we're doing this time around. And then other ways to have input as well, the Water Core team, which includes about 15 agencies that meets on a regular basis. those agencies are all getting updated on a regular basis regarding the IWRS and having input as well. I've been attending those meetings for quite a while now, and so their input is being heard as well. And then there's also a federal liaison team because, as you know, there's a large overlap and a lot of coordination happening with federal agencies within the state. So we have a team there put together that's also helping us with that update. Next slide, please. So outreach and engagement. I just want to highlight a few things that we did this spring. So we did have 7 in-person meetings spread across the state. We had 1 virtual option, and we had culturally specific conversations happening throughout the state. We also had 3 youth-specific events. So we did hire a facilitation consultant to help us with all of these. The Oregon's Kitchen Table was the organization that we use, and they're located within Portland State University, and they helped us design all of those engagement activities that I just outlined. They also helped us put together a public survey. So we did develop a public survey and release that and had that online and in paper. We had it translated into 9 different languages. And so all of that input from the surveys and then the in-person meetings and all of there were also self-led meetings that could be happening too, and that information reported to Oregon's Kitchen Table. All of that was summarized in a report that came to us at the end of July. So we have that as the, really the guiding information for us for developing the Integrated Water Resources Strategy update. Next slide. In addition to those pieces, things that we did not have involvement with Oregon's Kitchen Table, we also did an agency survey. So that was an interagency survey. It wasn't just within Water Resources Department, to hear from agency staff and leadership about what they would like to see changed in the Integrated Water Resources Strategy in that next version. We also have been doing outreach and consultation with tribes, and I've been giving presentations just like this to other boards and commissions to make folks aware that we are updating the document this year. Next slide, please. So some findings that we had from the public survey that I just wanted to share. You can read these later, but I just want to highlight really the big pictures there. There is concern from a lot of people about both the quality and quantity of water in the state. Not everyone has access to it, and people are very concerned about climate change and the impacts. A lot of unease in that regard. Next slide, please. And in the agency survey, it was helpful to learn that there's limited familiarity with the contents of that document. So just helpful to note that as far as making folks aware of the document itself, internally as well, it's important for us to share the information and make sure that folks understand how the Integrated Water Resources Strategy applies to their work. Next slide, please. And also, just in addition to giving presentations like this to different commissions, I did do more of a deep dive work session with the Water Resources Commission in June. That was a really nice conversation to hear about their ideas for the next, some more visionary ideas about what the next Integrated Water Resources Strategy could include. So there's a few things here. Climate, again, was a big topic of conversation. Next slide, please. So now I'll just do a very quick overview of some content in the IWRS. And I'll preface this with saying the document is about 200 pages and it has a lot. It's very dense. It has a lot of information in there. And so I'm just going to pull out some examples here of, some content, highlight the content, but also try to make it relevant to work that the Department of Agriculture is doing as well, and some partners. So yeah. So this slide here, the Integrated Water Resources Strategy Framework, that's what the 11 by 17 I passed out here. This is essentially one way to really to look at this is the table of contents of the Integrated Water Resources Strategy. There are 4 chapters in that document, each chapter being a 1, 2, 3, 4. Also, these are the objectives that are given within this. The 2 goals really of the overarching document are to understand our water resource needs and then to meet those needs. And then all of these objectives are intended to meet that. And then the very finest level of detail that we get down to on this framework is the 1A through 13E, which are referred to as recommended actions. And there's even more detail than that. So what you're seeing here, if you're not quite sure what would relate to one of those recommended actions, if you go into the document itself, For every recommended action, there's a bullet list of, it ranges, sometimes between 3 and 8 items of example actions. And that's where you would find the more specific information about maybe what program or agency would do that action, so that you're getting a little bit more detail there. But this is a really nice high-level picture of how the information is bucketed and kind of distributed throughout the document. Next slide, please. It's helpful. I like to think about these 4 different objectives, kind of simplify it down to number 1 being more about data for supplies, like understanding our groundwater and surface water supplies. The second one being data, but understanding more of the demand side of things. So both in-stream and out-of-stream are included in that bucket. And then the third bucket is pressures. So things like climate change show up there. And then moving over to the 4th bucket, which is really the solutions bucket. These are the actions we need to do to meet our water needs. It's argued, though, however, all of these actions really are needed to be done. But that last one is really more, I think, it's a little bit more project related, but also things that we all would connect with. Water solutions is things like water conservation, water reuse, and water storage, things of that nature. So water management generally. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to do a quick overview here of just some of the content. So that in those first recommended actions are really talking about improving our data abilities, so our monitoring and coordination both, so sharing that. And then the blue items that are shown, if you have the printouts of the PowerPoint, the blue text that I'm showing on each one of these slides, just for your knowledge, the 1A through 1C, those are just the recommended actions. The blue text are topics that are discussed in the narrative. So if you don't see something that shows up or you're curious about what is actually covered in those areas, I've kind of just highlighted some of those discussion points essentially in the narrative. Next slide, please. And so section 2, so we have both, now we're talking about in-stream and out-of-stream needs. This is where there is a call for regularly updating statewide water demand forecasts. I will note that the last one was done in 2015 and we haven't had one done since then. So the 2017 IWS has a lot of information and findings from that. Next slide. Next slide, please. And then actions 3A and 3B, those are really focused on in-stream needs. So understanding the flows that we need to support ecosystem needs, but also water quality goals as well. And then the 3B being understanding the groundwater dependent system. So in Oregon, we do have a lot of surface water and groundwater interactions that are critical. Next slide, please. So under the pressures category, water and energy is noted there. And so just acknowledging essentially that water and energy are linked because we use a lot of energy to move water around. And so whenever we're talking about changes to that, there is an energy impact as well. And then there's some forward-looking topics included in here, like looking for opportunities to have in-conduit hydroelectric when you're piping some irrigation and things like that. Pumped water storage is also a topic that's discussed as well. Next slide. Also still on the pressures, climate change and extreme events is a category there. So just 3 extreme events are covered in a little bit more detail in this, in the 2017 version. It's drought, significant documentation regarding drought, and then flood events, and then the Cascadia earthquake. And so I think that's important content just in terms of just thinking about where the IWS, what was happening in Oregon in the time that this was being developed. The drought in 2015 was a significant situation for folks, and so that was on people's mind when they in 2016 when they were working on the draft for this. So that's a significant element of the extreme events category. Next slide, please. And still in the pressures category, water-related infrastructure is in there. And so that category does talk about just the very high level, wide range of infrastructure and really getting at the fact that we need to be upgrading and updating our infrastructure to protect public health and safety. A few specific WRD programs are also mentioned there, like the well construction program and the dam safety program as well. Next slide, please. And finally, this is the last category in the pressures. So education and outreach is listed in there. And really this category tries to cover the full range of education and outreach that is needed regarding water issues. So starting from the first recommended action, talking about in our schools, having water and environmental education in our schools, all the way through that last recommended action they're talking about research needs. So partnering with research institutions to help us solve some water challenges that we have. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're moving over to more of the solutions category, the fourth objective in the framework here, that fourth box. So place-based efforts is a chapter that really starts off with talking about our planning approach. So there is a formal planning approach called place-based planning that began in 2015 as a pilot project. And that was led by the Oregon Water Resources Department with support from other agencies. And so that effort, right here on the slide here, we're showing the 4 locations that were the pilot locations. So we do have a mid-coast there location for that. So that is part of what's discussed in this chapter, but also just generally the need for, you know, kind of bridging that gap between state level planning and on the ground local planning. That's the concept that's being brought up. And then of course, even at a bigger scale too, there is a discussion about the important nature of partnering, right? The partnerships that we need across the state. We have water that borders all around Oregon. We need to be partnering with tribes and federal agencies and our other state partners as well in some important water issues. Next slide, please. Right, the water management and development category here. This section is quite large and significant. This has probably just about the most recommended actions. And I would look to maybe even see that expand a little bit in our next version. This is a pretty dense chapter. It covers a lot of pieces of the puzzle, things that people would, just like I had mentioned earlier, things that people would normally connect with. We have some water challenges. What do? We need some water conservation, some efficiency. So 10A there. 10B is talking about improve access to built storage. So that is where some aquifer storage and recovery is discussed. We've also got reuse mentioned there, and just looking at the, for opportunities essentially to encourage reuse and where we might be able to find a good match there between, primarily effluent and, reuse. And then the last few pieces there, the 10D through 10G, some of those are really talking more about that collaboration that happens with agencies and the public. So 10D, reach environmental outcomes with non-regulatory alternatives. This is a great example of one where it's like a high-level description might not be very helpful when you're looking at just the framework. If you dig into the document itself and look at those example actions, that's where it's bringing forward things like water quality treating, creative solutions, not all top-down regulatory solutions to water challenges. And then the last few, they're providing adequate presence in the field. That's a really important one for a lot of all of us, just in terms of how folks are functioning within their agencies and solving problems on the ground. So having staff that can see local issues, the partnerships that we have with watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts are really fundamental to how we're able to resolve water challenges. And then that last recommended action there is strengthening water quality and quantity permitting programs. Essentially acknowledging that we don't need to really increase the amount of regulation. We just need to, provide the staffing essentially for strengthening those existing programs that already exist. And then, of course, a few other topics are covered in more detail there. Next slide, please. Healthy ecosystems is the next chapter that I'm highlighting, or next section that I'm highlighting. This one really focuses mostly on restoration and how restoration can be used to increase recharge groundwater, essentially, floodplain restoration. It also gets into some habitat improvements as well, like recommendation 11D really talks about removing fish barriers, so there is some information specifically about that. And just also the possibility of protecting in-stream uses as well. So for fish and wildlife, that also is a topic that's discussed in this chapter. I think that is all I have on that one. Next slide, please. Public health. So this category, I think the content is a little a little misleading. It doesn't do a super deep dive into public health, but it does talk about some water quality challenges kind of at the front end. And then it really, the rest of the chapter is a little bit more about water quality permitting challenges. So that's really, where the document describes a little bit more about essentially DEQ's responsibilities in that regard. And of course, source water protection is another element that is discussed in this section, but really the take home here is that, this is a place in the document where drinking water is kind of highlighted and the importance of providing safe drinking water. Next chapter, or next slide, please. Last one. So this is the funding category. This is kind of the bookend on the just all of the recommended actions. Of course, all of the recommended actions that I've just quickly run through, they all require funding in some capacity, personnel, some of them actually just need policy, and that takes effort as well. But this funding category is essentially it really encapsulates all of the activities that are mentioned previously in the document. So the first one being funding the development and implementation of the integrated water resources strategy. So just acknowledging that there's a funding need right there. Oregon Water Resources Department has been tasked with leading the effort in terms of developing the document. So it's important that they have staff to do that as well. And that was missing between the last, the 2017 version and just last year. So I just came on board last year as the integrated water resources strategy, and that was even a limited duration position that has just now been made permanent. So just to kind of get the, set the context for, having us all coordinate on water, needing the staff to do that and the resources. And then the other, the second recommended action there is huge. It's funding water resources management activities at the state agencies. That's just acknowledging that we need to fund the responsibilities that we've given all of the different agencies regarding water, and it's spread across several in our state, so spread across several different agencies. And then those last three recommended actions there are talking about a little bit more of the traditional pathway for projects, where 13C is saying that we need to invest in that local and regional planning. So the planning part needs to come first, and then the next recommended action there is 13D, the feasibility studies. So making sure that we're able to fund those. That has been a gap in a lot of projects in the past where we don't have funding to test something out and see if it's worth moving forward on. And then that last recommended action, 13E there, that's the one that says invest in implementation of these water resources projects. So finally funding that project that you've decided is the answer to your challenge. So that's the very quick rundown of the contents of this 200-page document. Hope that wasn't too painful to get through. Let's go to the next slide, please. All that to say, even with 200 pages, there is some information that's currently missing. So this is what we're working on right now, is not only just in terms of responding to all of the comments that we have received and the desires that we've heard from so many different stakeholders and the public. In addition to that, we also know that there's just outright some things that are missing from the document. So the way that the state collaborates with tribes in the last 5 years has significantly changed. We need to reflect that. Climate change has a different role in our lives than it did 5 years ago. We need to reflect that as well. Currently, the way the document approaches that is that climate change is it's a concentrated section within the document, and we're looking at expanding that and making it very explicit, where we're including a recommended action that is an adaptation or resiliency strategy, just making that link a lot more explicit than it currently is. Accountability is another piece that is also missing. So there are a lot of recommended actions that are very clear about who would be doing that, just based on a program or a responsibility that an agency has. However, that's not the case for all of these. And I think it would really improve the accountability and the ability to track what we've done in the IWRS if we have the who associated with that. So that's something that we're looking at as well. Just making it more clear about who would be the right agency or stakeholder or partner to take on that recommended action. And then finally, there have been a lot of research documents and reports that have come out since 2017 that of course need to be reflected in that. We just had the latest climate report come out in January. We've got the 100-year water vision that occurred a couple years ago. So a lot of just new information, of course, being included into the document as well. So next slide, please. All right, we made it to questions and discussion. So with 5 minutes left, if folks want to ask me any questions about the IWS, feel free. I think the only other slide I have included here is my contact info. And if you would like to have me come present at a later date when we actually have more progress on what the update looks like, that's also an option as well. So questions?
Miguel Lopez. So
Yes.
earlier in your slide, when you were facilitating engagement, you had one section here that says culturally specific conversations.
Yes.
Can you get into
elaborate?
detail about that? What was that surrounding?
Yeah, so that was that's a method that Oregon's Kitchen Table uses within their, so that when they start a project, they do a bunch of outreach with their community partners and community-based organizations and a wide network of people across the state. And really the goal of that is to find who hasn't been involved in these conversations in the past and how can we get them involved. And so oftentimes there are language barriers included and also just cultural barriers where those folks would not be the ones that would be interested or comfortable in participating in one of the 7 larger kind of public meetings. And so that's an opportunity that they provide where they collaborate with often community leaders or other folks in a community to help lead their own conversation. So that's where they're providing them with guidance on, the questions that could be asked and then ways to record the answers and the information. And then they pass that information back over to Oregon's Kitchen Table. So there were several of those. I don't have those. We started trying to figure out if we could map those, but it was a little complicated because in a lot of cases, some culturally specific conversations were happening in certain parts of the state that were gathering people from other parts of the state. And we didn't want to just, present that information was only related to that geographic area because it was more reflective of a culture rather than, a specific location in the state. So, but a wide range of, different types of conversations that were happening, and more detail is provided on those in the full report that Oregon's Kitchen Table did. So I will say that on their website, we have a link on our Water Resources Department site to their site. They created 2 different reports, and they also have them translated in multiple different languages too. They've got a very short, nice and sweet 7-page summary report, and then they have the much more detailed one. And you can see all of the survey questions in the end there. They have a appendix that includes all of that, so you can see what we were asking folks.
Elon Miller, a comment and a question. We're going to be considering Resolution 295, Protection of Oregon Agriculture, and we've actually added water supply as one of the main focuses going forward. So this is kind of a timely thing, and we'll be discussing that whether or not the board approves that tomorrow. The second question I had, and this may be more related, Jonathan, or someone else, or Lauren. There was a huge water package that was presented kind of midway through the session, and there was a lot of question marks on the part of, let's just say, general public and some in the agricultural community of sources and why. And was that the funding mechanism for this, or what's the correlation of that huge package, which was narrowed?
Yeah.
One might say watered down, but narrowed down fairly dramatically. So could you give us kind of a feel, and then what ended up passing of what pieces here that?
Yeah, I'll just preface that with saying the package is so big, and even our legislative coordinator has distilled some information down. So I would not do it justice if I tried to point out all of those different pieces. But essentially, both in 2021 and 2023, we did see a bunch of water things rolled up in packages, right? And so those different funding packages are addressing a lot of different pieces on here in terms of providing staff. So for the coordination piece, which is a big call that is happening in the integrated water resources strategy, our data collection and management needs, also a big call. So I know that the transition that did happen just in funding, I can speak to one of those pieces. In 2017, folks acknowledge like one of the recommended actions here, 1C, is coordinated interagency data collection, processing, and use. And it also talks about being able to share that information, right? The public is, if the folks are going to start getting together and planning on the ground, they need access to that information. And right now it's happening at different agencies and it's hard to get your arms around if you want to use that information. That has led now to the Oregon Water Data Portal project, which is in its very early stages of development, but that did receive continued funding in this last water package. So we're going to be moving ahead as a state in terms of getting all of our water data to be a little bit more coordinated and shareable and usable for planning purposes. So that's really just an example. But yes, a lot of the, I believe it was House Bill 2010 that you're talking about that had just a ton of different pieces in there. And I had been tracking, or before that, the policy option packages that different agencies had put together and how it related to the integrated water resources strategy, but I haven't had time to see how those, have checked off and, have now related. That will be coming though in the future, once we get this this update kind of, solidified and start kind of moving into the work planning.
And just one additional question. Thank you for that. There were some comments made of, a lot of understanding where our water is a USGS focus, which obviously takes federal government. So with the federal government interaction with this, how, can't be tail wagging the dog, but sometimes it needs to be, right?
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a great example of where the narrative is intending to describe those relationships. So Oregon Water Resources Department has a close relationship with USGS and are often collaborating on studies together. So that's usually how these things happen, is that sometimes it's just federal money coming to a state agency to make something happen, and sometimes it's actually, staff collaborating and putting out something together. So that's, I think, a good example of how this document can be helpful for, just presenting. Yeah, right. But also presenting the coordination component, right? So that this isn't just a document that's showing, things that need to be done. Let's talk about the who is, working on those things and naming the agencies as well. Yeah. Anything?
Maybe not.
All right. Thank you for the presentation. The benefits of seeing this same presentation 6 days ago.
Faster this time.
Yeah, it was. We definitely dove in deep last week.
Yeah.
I did appreciate the change in your presentation to the 4 buckets. I read that was a really nice addition compared to last week. So it puts it into some good buckets.
Yeah.
So, did I hear you say you were limited duration and now you're permanent? This position is?
It had been approved, so
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
All of that transition still needs to happen, but yes, that's what did occur with House Bill 2010.
And then, were there any surprises in the open kitchen, the Oregon's open kitchen?
Oregon's kitchen table.
Kitchen table. Sorry. Sorry.
No, not really. Mostly because I had been physically, so it was really nice to have a facilitation consultant at all of our public meetings. That's just a really nice feature. But I was attending all of those, and giving a very brief overview, way more brief than what I just gave today in terms of just educating folks about what that integrated water resources strategy is. And so within those, attending all of those different meetings across the state, it seemed like we couldn't have planned it better, that every diverse opinion, it seemed like opposite ends of the spectrum were always showing up. And so I felt like I had a good exposure to that. And then the open-ended questions that we have, there's a lot of, I don't think surprises, but just, again, a lot of really different opinions and really, diverse views about how we acknowledging maybe the same problem, but different ways to get there. So yeah, I think that's probably the consistent nature, really. Of course, there were a lot of ways that people agreed on things, but a lot of ways that folks just are disagreeing right now about how to solve problems. Yeah.
And then I think one of the take homes that's going to be really important for you to drive home, and this is not to increase regulatory. And I just think I hear a lot of talk on the street that they're fearful that this is going to lead to more regulation. But I think so it's important for you to drive that home in some of your talks, because this is not to increase regulation.
Yeah, and I will add just another part that I was, I guess maybe I didn't expect to see so consistently. I heard it in the room in those meetings, but people were very grateful for staff on the ground. They love their soil and water conservation districts. They love their watershed council folks. They love their water masters even. I was surprised to hear that. And so that's just a really important piece of the puzzle to understand that people acknowledge that they appreciate that staff and they're helping them solve water problems, and they acknowledge that they need funding. They need to be there, right? If you don't have a water master to help you, that's a problem. So yeah, just folks are making that connection that agencies need to be funded to have the staff to be able to do the things. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I can have a minute. One question. I'm just curious about your outreach and engage.
Yes.
You said you made a survey with 9 different languages.
Yes.
I was curious about all the languages, but well, you don't have to tell me those. But how was the response? How many people did answer to those? How do you approach them? How do you get those?
So the Oregon's Kitchen Table report has the detailed breakout of who was responding in different categories. That was a great way to, we're able to collect demographic data on and language data on this public survey. So the Oregon's Kitchen Table has the detailed breakout for folks, but just in terms of the big number, 1,700 responses. So, and that included, so that wasn't all folks just applying online. So in a lot of cases, I don't remember the exact number that were paper, but in some of those culturally specific conversations or community-led conversations, some of those were paper, and then those were given back to Oregon's Kitchen Table to manually enter, and in many cases also translate too. So there's, it's quite an effort, but really helpful to see that process and understand, from me on the front end, and if I'm doing this again in the future, to see how that plays out. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have some questions maybe from our members joining us remotely? No? All right. So thank you very much for your presentation today. All right. Thank you to keep us in the schedule too. You did in a really fast and good way. All right. So our next item in our agenda is introduction. This is to Clean Fuels Program and Renewable Fuel Standards in Oregon. So I'm going to call Stephen Harrington from the ODA Weights and Measure Program Manager and Corey Ann Gwynn, the Q Program Manager. Please introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Chair Santa Maria. This is first time to one of these events, so I'm not sure what the protocols are for. My name's Steve Harrington. I'm program manager for Oregon Weights and Measures, specifically the Motor Fuel Quality Program. And one of the things that our Motor Fuel Quality Program does is to enforce the state's renewable fuel standards. My colleague here, Corey Wind, I'll let her introduce herself.
Oh, good morning, Chair. So my name is Corey Ann Wind. I work for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and I'm the program manager for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program.
Okay. I thought for just to open it up, what I would do was to say that we did, as part of the motor fuel, as program manager for the motor fuel quality program, was asked to look over the resolution number 269. And really what I can say is almost everything that I see in here is very much true today in terms of what the department's doing for enforcement activity for renewable fuel standards. It's we go out on a regular basis. We use our weights and measures program inspectors. We have 22 staff operating statewide in our weights and measures program. 5% of their salaries are paid from the Motor Fuel Quality Fund in order to conduct this this sort of work. And largely what we're doing in this sort of work is we're doing an audit of paperwork when we arrive on site, product transfer documents, bills of lading, to make sure that there's evidence there that there's compliance with the state renewable fuel standard, which is one of which is going to be the 10% ethanol standard, and the other one is going to be the minimum of 5% biodiesel standard. That happens every time we go to one of the gas stations, so it's an efficiency that we have, that we can, those two programs can work together that way, because after they get done with that review of those compliance documents, then they're going to go through and do their testing in association with the weights and measures program, which is going to be to test the devices and so on. And I guess I can probably leave it at that and see if anybody has any specific questions for me on how the program operates or what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. So let's see, Carla, I think Carla's got the slides. Okay, next slide, please. So I've been working with Steve in conjunction between the Department of Agriculture and Department of Environmental Quality for several years now. The Oregon Clean Fuels Program actually originates from a bill back in the 2009 legislative session. And then we've been working on designing and implementing the program since there. Originally in our advisory committees, when we were designing the program, we did have participation by the Department of Agriculture as we designed and stood up the framework of the program. The goal of the Clean Fuels Program is to reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from Oregon's transportation fuels. As you probably know, so as far as climate pollution, transportation sources make up about 40% of the emissions for the entire state. So it is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so thus this program really focuses on removing and reducing the excuse me, greenhouse gas emissions from those fuels. What you see on this slide here is basically it's the compliance standard for our program. So we started designing the program back in 2010, but we began implementation in 2016 after many years of working with our stakeholders on implementing the program. So what we did is we take our baseline year of 2015 and the carbon emissions that come from Oregon's transportation fuels, and over the next several years, steadily decline those emissions. So we increase the reductions. So you can see at the beginning of the program, it's really little, percentages, 0.25%, 0.5%, 1% reduction, so that we can really kind of let people, the entities that provide fuels and produce fuels, start innovating in those technologies and start blending more biofuels and introducing more lower carbon fuels into the system. And over a period of time, it gets more aggressive. So if you see out into the out year, it's about 2035, where we have standards that we require 37% reductions. So it gets really steep really fast. As you can see, we're in 2023 now, we're at about 6.5% reductions. And so we're getting to that really steeper part of our schedule. Partially, this is due to the fact that we know that there are innovations in vehicles coming, right? You hear a lot about electric vehicles, whether it's light duty vehicles or heavy duty vehicles. Excuse me. So that is reflected in the regulations that the state of Oregon has adopted and that we anticipate. But it also includes here some increasing use of biofuels in the interim between now and when all those vehicles do become electrified. I'm happy to say that in the first 7 years of the program, we have seen over 9 million tons of greenhouse gases that have been reduced in the state of Oregon. And that roughly is about displacing about 2 billion gallons of fossil fuels. So, you know, we've had some really good early success, and we see a lot more potential with this program. What you see on kind of the left-hand part of this graph also is the fuels that we consider as part of this regulation. So we do, providers of fossil fuels, so gas and diesel, are required to participate in the program, as well as providers of ethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel. And then there are other fuels that we use for transportation as well, but in lesser quantities. Natural gas, propane, hydrogen is starting to emerge as a fuel, electricity, and also things like sustainable aviation fuel, which is basically renewable jet fuel. And so anything that can be used for transportation, right, to get a vehicle from point A to point B is covered by the regulation. And what the regulation basically requires is that providers of these fuels have to report into DEQ on a quarterly basis of how much fuel and what kinds of fuel, because it's the what kinds of fuel that really matter as far as what the carbon emissions are. And I'll get to a little bit more detail in the next slide. Okay, next slide. Yep. Okay, so when I talk about emissions from transportation fuels, we're actually talking about life cycle emissions. So it's not just what comes out of the tailpipe of a car, but it's how you make the product, what it's made from, how it's shipped and transported to Oregon, and as it's combusted in an engine. So when we talk about something like a gas or a diesel, we go all the way back to how that crude is pumped out of the ground, where it is, goes how it gets to a refinery. In Oregon, most of it is refined in the Puget Sound area, so in those refineries and shipped down in pipeline, and then distributed amongst throughout Oregon to gas stations, and then combusted in a vehicle. If you're talking about something like a biofuel, something like ethanol or biodiesel or renewable diesel, it's what is it made from? So we do consider, is it biodiesel that's made from canola or soybean? Or is it made from used cooking oil or tallow? Those are kind of the common feedstocks that are used for biodiesel. For ethanol, it's almost all corn-based. There's a little bit of sorghum, and there's a little bit of kind of cellulosic. So whether it is corn fibers or whether it's ag waste or those kinds of things, you can make it ethanol out of that as well. And so we at the agency at DEQ, actually we use a model from Argonne National Laboratory, and we actually calculate all the emissions from the life cycles of all of the fuels that come into Oregon. We manage about 150 different types of fuels because we do break down where it's made, right? Corn ethanol made in Boardman is different than corn ethanol made in Nebraska because of the electricity that's used in the facility, for example. Farm ag practices. If you have a farm that is no-till and it really restores carbon in its soil, and you lower the utilization of pesticides, fertilizers, and if you have biodiesel in your tractors, or if you have electric tractors, right? All of that matters as far as how we calculate those emissions. And so what we're trying to promote is lower and lower carbon. So what that...
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Or you want me to wait till the end?
Oh.
It's you tell me what you would prefer.
Go ahead, go ahead.
This graph is interesting. Maybe I'm not reading it right. In the combustion part, I don't understand the column where hydrogen is at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. So on the bottom part of the screen, basically what all of those dots represent are different pathways. That's what we call them, you know, like what a fuel feedstock and how it's made. So those are the different pathways that we approve. So where the black dotted line is where gas and diesel is. We'll just call it 100. It's like 100 and 101. And the measurement here is actually in grams of CO2 equivalents per megajoule, right? We have to normalize for all the different types of fuels, whether gaseous or electricity or whatnot. So if you start from what gas and diesel are about 100, the lower carbon ones all the ones to the left, all the different dots. And you can see the gradations all the way from like -700 all the way kind of up into that 100 range. And then you do see that hydrogen one that sits above that line, which is hydrogen, which is higher carbon. So this is hydrogen that's just made from like, it's not green hydrogen. So it's not made from renewable electricity. It's not hydrolysis. It's just reformed hydrogen using fossil fuels. What happens with some of these fuels too, it's like for electricity and hydrogen especially, the electric motors are, or the fuel cells are more efficient than a combustion engine. So you actually have a factor of about 3 to 5 where it's more efficient. So even in something like this high carbon hydrogen, if it's used in a fuel cell vehicle, it's actually about like 20% lower than that. So in some cases, it can actually be more clean than diesel that it replaces. But it's a really when we work with fleets and we work with, whether it's light duty or passenger vehicles, transit agencies, whatnot, to make these calculations. But this gives you kind of a flavor of like, the range of different kind of carbon emissions from these different types of fuels. Okay, so next slide. So really quickly, what this is trying to show to you is that when we do talk about these cleaner fuels, something that's cleaner, lower carbon than gas and diesel, this is what is contributing to the reductions in carbon in the state of Oregon. So if you start from the bottom, from the lightest of the colors, that pukey green color is ethanol. So this is that 10%-ish part of gasoline that is sold in Oregon. I'll show a slide for you. The next slide actually has some blend rates and like what that percentages are. But so ethanol is present in gasoline all the time because of the renewable fuel standard. And so there is a pretty steady presence of ethanol in the state. And then the next two you'll see is that orange one is the biodiesel, and the next kind of tealish color is renewable diesel. So this is where it plays into the other part of the renewable fuel standard, a 5% minimum mandate. But what we've seen in biodiesel and renewable diesel is increasing amounts, like pretty heavy increases in the amount of those fuels that are coming into the state. And that's because on the truck side of things, 5% is not a maximum, right? It's a minimum, and you can take much more. In the case of biodiesel, you could probably go up to 20%, no problem, and more so if you have certain technologies that are on your trucks. In the case of renewable diesel, you can replace 100% of the diesel with renewable diesel with no changes to your truck or fueling infrastructure. And so you can see in the last kind of, the last year, 2 years of the program, some steady increases in both the biodiesel and renewable diesel. And then the other two, the top, the darker teal is the electricity, kind of alluded it to before. Oregon is heavily invested in electric vehicle regulation. So you will see going into the future, some very, very steep increases in the amount of electricity that's going to be used for transportation. And then that gray bar is speaking to the other fuels like propane and natural gas. Next slide. So what we'll show here then is on the one on the left is the blend rates of the ethanol in the gasoline is in that blue line. So you can see kind of some variation between 10 and 15%. That's to be expected, like all the passenger vehicles, it's E10 that's in the retail gas stream. There are some fleet applications, I would say, that have higher blends of gasoline. You can take 15% up into the newer vehicles, and there are some flex fuel vehicles that also take up to like 85% ethanol. So there is some variation in there. There's hopes on the national front to actually increase that to 15%, but we'll see. We'll see how that kind of evolves in the future. And what you see in the red line on the left then is the biomass-based diesel. So again, when you add up the biodiesel and the renewable diesel, some really significant increases in the percentages. I think in the Q1 2023 data that we just finished auditing, we're up to about 25% of the total diesel used in the state of Oregon is now biomass-based. That again is up from 5% in 2016. So that's big increase. On the right-hand side, what these graphs are trying to show is that even with the ethanols and the biodiesels and the biofuels that we have, it is actually getting cleaner as well, right? So from a carbon intensity standpoint or for the emission standpoint, if you look at something like the top line is ethanol, in the beginning of the program, 2016, we're talking about the emissions being about 65 grams per megajoule, and now that they're decreased to like 55, right? So how that ethanol is made is becoming cleaner. With the biodiesel, you'll see a lot more variation. And you'll see that in the biomass-based diesels, because when you switch from making it from, like, say, canola and soy to a waste product like used cooking or tallow, you get a big jump in emissions reductions. And so soy and canola, think of maybe like 55, 50 carbon intensities. But if you're talking about used cooking oil and tallow, it's like 10, 15, 20, right? So you see this kind of stepwise decrease. And so depending on how much of the different products we're getting into the state, you see this overall decline in the cleanliness of that product. The purple line with the renewable diesel, so this is my lack of good Excel skills. So forget the kind of, like, if you see the big dips at the zeros, so those are not real. So if you can subtract that, I didn't put a trend line in. But again, what you're seeing here is a lot of renewable diesel coming into the state. And I would say that the most of it that we've been getting for the last couple of years is from Washington. It's from the BP Cherry Point facility. They make both fossil diesel and renewable diesel. And they primarily use tallow to make their renewable diesel. But as the demand for renewable diesel has increased, you can't always get the good lowest carbon stuff. And so there are several facilities that are now bringing in renewable diesel that are soybean based. And so again, higher carbon intensity, but still lower than regular fossil diesel, right? So instead of getting 80% reduction, you're getting about 50% reduction. But that has allowed the import of renewable diesel into the state to increase to about 20 million gallons at this point, right? So really steady increases. And the next slide. And so just lastly, what I'm trying to describe here too is like, so the Clean Fuels program is a market-based program, right? So the mechanism here is that the higher carbon fuels, if you're higher than what the standard is for that year, generates deficits for the program. And if you have a fuel that you're bringing in that is lower carbon, you generate credits. And a credit and a deficit is a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. So depending on how low or higher carbon intensity is and how much fuel you're bringing in, then you generate credits and deficits. And somebody who is regulated in the program must have enough credits to offset the number of deficits that they accrue over a year, right? So if you're a provider of that lower carbon product and you're generating credits, that's what's driving your market, right? So if you're a regulated party, just take X oil company, and you're bringing in a bunch of gas and diesel, right? So you're generating deficits on all of that. So you can also, these oil companies are also now making a ton of cleaner, lower carbon fuels as well, right? So if you're BP sitting up at Cherry Point, you're also making renewable diesel. So that renewable diesel is generating credits. So that's how they comply. If they can make enough credits to offset their deficits, then that's their compliance path. They can also contract with other clean fuel providers to buy their fuel because they're going to have to blend it in state anyway, right? And in that contractual agreement, they say, well, I'll buy your fuel, but I want the credits from that biodiesel too. And then that's how they're complying. Or the third way is if they don't have any of those agreements, they can go into the market and buy credits. So the Clean Fuels program also has the market for the purchase and sale of those credits. So they can purchase the credits, and then that's the third way that they can comply. So the price for the credits is what changes, right? Supply and demand. And so our credit prices in Oregon right now are very healthy. About $35, $140 a ton for the credits in the state of Oregon. The program is only implemented in California and Washington. Washington just started this year, so they don't have a credit price yet. California has been implementing since 2010, and their credit prices are about $75 a ton. Right? So if you're a random, credit generator, you want to bring fuels to the state of Oregon so you can get that revenue, right? So that's how the cost of compliance for the program works. So what this, long story to get to this slide. So what this slide is trying to portray then is with the credit prices in the program, what then the cost of compliance is translated to a gallon of fuel. Okay, so in the first two lines of this is E10 gasoline, B5 diesel. And if a provider of these fuels or one of these oil companies, if they do nothing to comply and all they do is go into the market and buy credits at the market price, then what you'll see is this 6 cent per gallon impact or an 8 cent per gallon impact for gas and diesel. Okay, so that's on the cost side. But if you're doing all of those other things that I want you to do, blend more biofuels, lower the carbon intensity of those fuels, switch to electricity, those kinds of things, then something like a B20, right, is a very common blend when you go to a truck stop. And because the increased use of biodiesel generates credits, so it's actually saving you 2 cents per gallon, right? So it's real common now to go to a truck stop and see B20 cheaper than B10. A B5, excuse me. And so it's actually, savings, cost savings to the fleet. If you have a product like, I'm going to switch to the one at the bottom, like a tallow-based renewable diesel, right? Tallow is very low carbon because it's a waste grease, and with the credit prices at this point, you're saving almost $1 a gallon. And you can replace 100% of renewable diesel into diesel, right? So yes, it costs more to make renewable diesel. So what we're seeing at the rack in Portland these days is like you can get renewable diesel for about 10 to 15 cents cheaper than B5, right? So then now it just becomes an economic decision for somebody that wants the fuel, right? It's like if you're going to go for a cheaper fuel and you get the bonus of a lower carbon and higher performing product. But that's what the Clean Fuels Program is really trying to do, is that provide that incentive to get it to be lower carbon. Yeah. Okay. That's all I have for slides. I'll take any questions if you have any.
Elin Miller, I guess one question, and maybe because I'm kind of catching up with renewable versus bio. But if you looked at ethanol and you looked at cellulosic ethanol, because it would be made of, let's say, wheat straw or rice straw or whatever, would that be considered more renewable? Because it was basically, it's a byproduct of the harvest of wheat or rice or whatever.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Right. So okay, so maybe I'll start on the biodiesel versus the renewable diesel. So there we're actually talking about a whole different technology to process the fuel. So in biodiesel, it's I'm going to get it all wrong now. In biodiesel, it really is a conversion to an ester. It's a fatty acid methyl ester.
That's correct.
A FAME product, and so it's really a chemical reaction to get to the biodiesel, and that's actually why you can only use a certain percentage of biodiesel blended with diesel, right?
For the machinery.
For the trucks, exactly, and for the infrastructure, for the fueling infrastructure. There is that limitation there. With renewable diesel, what you're actually taking is off refinery, right? You're taking a refinery that was designed to put crude into it, but instead of putting crude in the front end, you're putting tallow, right? So what you're getting out at the end of it is still meets the ASTM standard for diesel. So that's why, so it's a whole different process. So that's the difference on the diesel side. On the ethanol side, that doesn't exist. That difference doesn't exist. And so I think on an ethanol side, if I say biomass or renewable or what have you, it's just that the feedstock that it's made from is renewable, as opposed to making it from crude in a gasoline product. So we do have ethanols that are starch-based, sugar-based, and then cellulosic-based, right? And so in something like a cellulosic, like a wheat straw or a corn fiber, because it is a waste product, we don't start counting the emissions until it's a waste. So then that's the carbon emissions then is much lower. So like there was a pilot facility up in Boardman, the Zeochem facility that was processing poplar, hybrid poplar, but it could have done wheat straw or any kind of cellulosic material. And the carbon intensities that we were looking at there were kind of in the 20s, right? So really low carbon because it was a waste product. Where if you're looking at something from like corn, like I said, it's kind of 60-ish. If you're looking at sugar cane, it's kind of 40-ish maybe, you know, so, and you'll see kind of grades of that. What we're also seeing now in the Midwest is a real upswing of carbon sequestration projects that are associated with corn ethanol refineries, and those will reduce emissions by about half as well. So we're working with a facility now where carbon emissions is about like 30 from, you know, a corn ethanol refinery, but then, you know, doing carbon injection at that site as well. So there's a lot of technology, there's a math that's kind of lies in between all the carbon scores for these. Yeah.
Miguel Lopez, circling back to your first slide, Clean Fuels Program in a nutshell. Are we meeting the reduction schedule as presented?
Yes. Yep. We have all the regulated parties have complied with the standard. There is over compliance in the program right now. And so when I mean over compliance is there is an excess of credits at the end of the year, in excess of what the deficits that had to be retired. And so the credits in the program don't have an expiration date. So if somebody over complies earlier in the program, they can retain their credits and use it for future compliance. So on a whole, we do have more credits than we need right now.
So that would be like saying, I did a great job this year, but
Wait, pardon?
That would be like saying I did a good job this year with my credits, but next year I totally goofed off so I can use whatever I had left saved up.
Yep, there are no expiration dates for the credits.
Chad Allen here. I had a question in regards of how methane productions and digesters are applied to this program.
Yeah, really good question. Actually, thanks for asking that because I forgot to mention it. So in that, if I'm going back to kind of the slide that says credits by fuel type, so in that gray area where there's natural gas and propane, so it kind of falls in there. So the natural gas that we use in trucks here and transit agencies are almost all renewable natural gas instead of fossil natural gas these days. Most of that natural gas is made from either, so it started off being mostly landfill waste and then wastewater treatment plant waste, and now it's almost all dairy digester waste. So these are dairies not only in the state of Oregon, but outside of the state of Oregon as well. Producers that then register with the program and inject the renewable natural gas into a pipeline system, and we work on a booking claim system so that as somebody puts it into a pipeline and they can take it out of the pipeline and get credit for that use here, as long as it can be proven that it was taken out and put into a vehicle. So mostly the transit agencies are doing this. And then, so most of the renewable natural gas now is coming from dairy digester methane recovery systems.
But it has the potential of feeding two types, I guess, because also electricity.
Yep, absolutely. So in that the darker teal where it says electricity, so some of that electricity is very low carbon, negative carbon intensity dairy digester gas going to electric generators feeding into electric vehicles as well. that's been a really nice evolution of the program too. There's a lot of dairies that do have this gas, but can't connect to a pipeline, right? And it's more feasible for them to put in electricity generation and then, and then contract to be able to deliver that renewable electricity then to an electric vehicle. Yeah, and we'll continue to see a lot more of that in the future.
Yeah, I think Tillamook's got 3 of them. They're in the county now.
Barbara Boyer, 2 questions as far as the price set for the credits. Who establishes those?
There is no set price for the credits, so that is just a market price for it. So what we do is that when 2 parties buy and sell the credits, they have to report into the agency and they tell us how many credits and at what price. And then we publish that on a monthly basis for transparency for the market so that everybody knows what kind of the going rate for the credits are, and that's how the credit prices actually are established.
And it's so much higher in Oregon. I guess I can't wrap my brain around California and what was the other state you mentioned?
Washington.
Washington. So I'm just trying to figure out why there's so disparate, the disparities between the 2.
Yeah, well, so with Washington, they literally just started their program January 1st this year. So even their first quarter of reporting didn't get submitted until the end of July. So they just don't have a market yet. In California, what's going on is, I'm trying to make it simple. So their program started in 2010. And then they had updates in 2020. So they're kind of like, they had their first year of the program and then their second year. And what happened is that they set the stringency of the requirements, they are way over complying. Kind of going back to this question about so you have a bunch of credits, and if you have too many credits, if there's a glut of credits, it's what's bringing the price of those credits down. So until the agency can increase the stringency of their targets and thus create more demand for the credits, the credit prices won't increase. California is in a rulemaking process right now, and they are going to be significantly increasing the stringency of their program to meet California's goal of carbon neutrality in 2040, right? So this program, reducing transportation emissions, is critical to that. And so our program right now is out to 37% reductions in 2035, right? They're going to be out at, 40, 50% reductions kind of in that same time frame. When they get through that regulatory process, right, we'll see a big change in the market. But I think it's all of the jurisdictions know that. So we're all kind of leapfrogging each other. It is a regional market, right? I mean, transportation fuels is regional and it is national, it's international. So it's constant watching of those market features to make sure that our regulations in Oregon are kind of in the right spot.
Another question, Barbara Boyer. I might not have heard you right, and this is all new to me, so I'm really trying to assimilate everything today. I love it, but I'm still a novice at this. Did I hear you say that you don't count the emissions until it's waste?
So for the fuels that are made from waste products, right? So if you're talking about dairy digesters, right? Part of the reason why that carbon intensity is so low is because the manure is a waste product. For forest biomass that is being used to produce renewable diesel, right? If you're already managing the forest lands and you have slash piles that you are going to burn, but instead you're going to go harvest that and bring that down to a facility, right? So when something becomes a waste is when we start counting carbon emissions. So we don't talk about what it costs to make the potato chip, right? But once that used oil becomes a waste, then we say, do you have to do additional processing? Does it have to be taken to another facility? Does it have, right? And that's why those emissions for the waste products are much lower. But if it's a crop-based feedstock, say soybean, right? And so then, there are emissions that are associated with growing that and harvesting, and right, so that's why there are more emissions for something that's crop-based versus waste-based.
Eric Orem. I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around the slide number 2 still. So if I understand it correctly, in the next 10 years, we're going to have to go 5 times what we are currently at today. Is there consideration for technology or that's not there yet, or lack of energy sources? That's the infrastructure isn't there yet. I guess what I'm wondering is will we get to a point where it just becomes a carbon credit exchange game, and not, are we truly at that point going to be meeting our goals, or are we just buying and selling credits to make it look like we're covering it? And then just from an outside perspective, I guess, and back to the technology part, the electric vehicles are neat. They're great, and it shows that it's. But when it comes to the farm production, I know there's electric tractors, and I've seen them at the farm shows, but I would invite you to the field, and I would see on a mass production on a family farm how spread out we are. We don't just harvest the field next to our house and then drive the combine to the shop every night to charge it back up, right? We are taking 500 to 1,000 gallons of fuel to the field every day to just run the operation with no way of recharging, I guess. And maybe technology down the road will come. I looked at an electric vehicle or electric pickup, and it'll go 100 to 200 miles, depending on if you're towing or not. And so I'm hoping that technology gets there, because we drive that much every day. So, but going back, sorry, I kind of got off on a side note, but going back, I worry that it'll just turn into a carbon credit game or market that really is not giving us the benefit we're looking for from this. It's because it gets awfully steep awfully quick. So I guess your comment to.
Yeah, I'll actually speak to both of those kind of separately. I'll separate them out. So first on the carbon market and the credits thing. So in the Clean Fuels Program in Oregon, it's carbon, and I'm going to separate this out from, say, the Climate Protection Program, so our Cap and Invest program. So there's a lot of times where in a climate protection program setting, you talk about like an obligation, like a compliance instrument, I believe is the technical name, but that's a credit. I'll call it a credit for, and that is, something that the agency gives to a company and says, these are how many you have this year, and next year it's going to get lower and lower and lower. And that's something that the agency actually gives to the parties. That's not how it works in the Clean Fuels Program. So you only generate a credit after you've already demonstrated that you've provided that lower carbon fuel. Okay, so this is not a monopoly money kind of a credit. You get the credit when you deliver that lower carbon fuel. And so that means that the reduction has already happened. Okay, and then you get this thing that's credit that you can sell. So that would be the difference in a lot of people's minds about how the credits are actually work. So that's that part. Does that make sense?
It does, but if you get, sorry, Eric Orem again, if you get to a point where we can't blend anymore, I mean, is that then those credits cease at that point, or they only get credits for the maximum blend rate, and then I guess, is there gonna? I'm just looking as a percentage, because it does get so steep so quick. I think it will be. It seems like it would be hard for them to keep up, I guess, with
Right. Okay. Yeah. So just that. So
technology-wise.
Technology-wise, exactly. So in this, like when you see the steepness of this curve too, so in 2035, it's a 37% reduction. When we did the rulemaking for that, we had a technical study that actually we did scenarios about what we thought could be the vehicles and fuels in that time frame. So it doesn't assume like all electric. It assumes, yes, we have compliance with advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks, those regulations that our Environmental Quality Commission has passed, right? But even that means, for example, in advanced clean cars, starting in 2035, you've probably heard this, right? All new car sales need to be electric. It's still going to take a long time until the fleet turns over, right? So there will still be gas combustion cars. So there will still be gasoline. Even on the truck side, there's an increasing percentage of trucks that need to be electric, but not a mandate for all of them to be, right? So out in 2035, we assumed an increasing number, but it's not like all of the trucks and cars are going to be electric. So we have a lot of wiggle room within the standard for lower carbon liquid fuels. On that side, we assumed that 35% of the diesel was going to be biomass based, so lower carbon. But I just showed you a slide today that says Q1 of this year, it's already 25%, right? The market is basically causing that to happen because the credits are driving that price cheaper. So you'll take that cheaper fuel. So I think even when we did our assumptions of 35%, biomass-based diesel in 2035, that's way conservative. So there's way more potential for those liquid biofuels to basically generate more credits because there's going to be a market to continue. So that's probably the place where I know our modeling was more conservative. Yeah. I think we could support a lot more of it. And then you'll get more credits out of those biomass-based diesels that could then potentially make up for what happens if the electric vehicles don't come, right? If the electric sector doesn't generate those credits, then there's other places in the market that can. I mean, and in addition, I guess I would say it's like this is a regulation for the agency, right? And we're required periodically to go to our commission and give an update about what, the on an annual basis, how the program is performing. And if there are any kind of signals like, hey, our modeling forecasts were wrong and the market is not responding how we thought it was going to, we always have the ability to go back and change that.
Since we don't have more questions, I would like to ask if someone of the joining us remotely have a question. Questions? Carla, can you check? No? All right. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really informative, actually. I appreciate that. All right. So we're we have concluded our meeting this morning, but before that, I would like to give some remarks for the Board of Agriculture. Today, the board is gonna have a tour, and we're hoping to, not hoping, we want to leave at 1 from here. And we have a lunch that is provided for the board members and ODA staff. And the closing remarks are tomorrow morning, starting at 8:15, we will host a coffee with the board. This will be an opportunity for industry representatives, community members, and ODA staff from the local area to visit with board members prior to the start of the board meeting. We did that last session and it works very nice. The board meeting will reconvene at 9 a.m. Tomorrow morning, August 17. And with that, thank you very much. You are free for lunch. Session done.